Once the weeding was finished, the four moved on to planting, and when everything was done, we walked back to Mystic Valley together. Dang Wu fell into step beside me and asked about the knots he had hit in the withered wind leg. He had no love for swords, so of the 3 disciples, he alone drilled the leg technique with any diligence. I answered him patiently the whole way, keeping the white spirit rat pinned firmly in one hand so it could not slip loose and wander again. Back at the valley, I found that Li Ya, who had gone down to the outer sect that morning, had already returned, while Zhao Rim had not shown himself at all. That last part suited me perfectly. Li Ya explained that the World Outer Sect Assembly had ended and the season of intersect exchanges was beginning. Disciples would be patrolling the region, he said, so he ought to head back. I let a look of reluctance settle over my face and told him I would not dream of holding him. His heart was set on the immortal Tao, and I could never let myself delay a road like that. If he ever wished to return, he need only come, and so long as I still drew breath, I would be waiting here. He nodded, then drew me up into the pavilion, shut the door, and set 3 white jade bottles on the table. He named them, one by one, Foundation Establishment Pills, High-Grade Spiritual Chi Pills, and Marrow Cleansing Pills, and warned me to keep them hidden. Above all, he pressed, I was to save 1 pill for myself and trust none of my disciples too far, since plenty of people would murder their own master for medicine like this. I protested that even 100 years as Valley Master would never earn me the Spirit Stones to pay him back. He glared and snapped that there was nothing to pay back. I was his junior brother, he said, and if I refused the bottles, he would never return. So I accepted them, reluctant and deeply moved. Then he warned me that demonic cultivators had clashed 100 miles off the night before, leaving several geniuses dead. Their deaths would pull investigators from every direction, he said, so I should not leave the valley for a few days. I nodded and opened my mouth to answer, but he had already turned away. He did not take the door. He leapt through the window onto his flying sword, shot upward, skimmed the peaks, and vanished. I stood looking at the 3 bottles for a long while, then sighed, swept my sleeve across the table and folded them all into my storage pouch. Late that night, I made my way down into the 8 sceneries grotto heaven and walked to the foot of the azure vine tree. Gang Gyeong sat in meditation before the pill furnace. Her aura swelled until it stood a hair below the 9th level of the core formation realm. I felt genuinely glad for her, because it meant she was finally going to leave. Her voice drifted out to say her good grand disciple had not visited in an age, and that she had half thought I had forgotten her. I stepped up to salute and asked her, helplessly, to please drop the word good, since a grand disciple like me truly could not bear the weight of it. Demonic cultivators were demonic cultivators, I thought, and they simply talked like that. She only pursed her lips and smiled. I drew the Yao Beast egg from my storage pouch, held it up, and asked what kind of creature it was. She opened her eyes and glanced at it with plain indifference, and then, just as she began to look away, something snagged in her mind and her eyes flew wide. She turned and snatched the egg from my hand, examining it so intently that her gaze seemed to bore clean through the shell. Watching her, I felt a quiet dread bloom in my chest, because clearly this thing was anything but ordinary. When Li Ya had spoken of the demonic cultivators fighting the night before, I had guessed the rat must have scavenged this from the battlefield, she murmured, almost to herself, that it truly was the sacred beast of the Go-Ho sect. A sacred beast. My eyelids twitched wildly and I felt a sudden urge to strangle the white spirit rat, since surely this was nothing but fresh trouble laid at my feet. She pressed the egg back into my hands and told me what it was. It was a sky dragon, she said, a rare beast of the mortal world that carried the bloodline of a true dragon. It could grow into a 9th-rank Yao beast of terrifying potential, with the raw force to flatten mountains and overturn seas. The Go-Ho sect revered it as their sacred beast, and I was to raise it well. A sky dragon served only one master across its whole life, gentle toward that master and savage toward everyone else. If its master ever fell, she warned, the creature would go mad and slaughter the common people wholesale. Hearing all that, I hurried to say that since it was so fearsome, she ought to keep it herself as a helper while she roamed the cultivation world. She asked, with a teasing smile, whether I truly meant it, and I nodded, my face as sincere as I could make it. Something in her softened, and I could see she was moved to spite herself. She had faked her death for 70 years, betrayed into that ruin, and across those years she had learned to hate a great many people. When we first met, she had been all suspicion, which was why she had tested me once she recovered her body. She forced the sky dragon egg back into my hands, and where her fingers met mine, I felt a thread of cool air. She told me not to decline since the azure vine tree needed real strength to guard it, and if I raised the beast down here, I would never fret about exposure. Put that way, it made good sense, and I realized it would also keep future thieves from making off with my herbs. I sighed and told her fine. She began to recount the legends and habits of the sky dragon so that I might understand it better. The more I listened, the more my excitement grew, until I ached with anticipation for the day it would hatch. In the end, I left the egg beneath the azure vine tree for her to nurse. Over the following month, the figures crossing above Mystic Valley thinned out, and at last, 3 whole days passed without a single cultivator in the sky, so I finally left the valley. I still had my odd jobs to tend, and they were no small source of lifespan income. Set beside fighting and killing, I much preferred earning my lifespan the slow, solid, unremarkable way. At noon, I went first to Jin Li's immortal cave, and finding him out, I spent the span of a stick of incense tending his herbs, before moving on. Next came Li Hyunyu's immortal cave, and she too was away, so I set to work. Being a princess, she had lately planted a fresh batch of 5th-rank herbs, and the site left me brimming with expectation. 5th-rank herbs needed at least 5 years to mature, sometimes 10 or more, but I could afford to wait. I had nearly finished when Li Hyunyu herself returned. I cupped my hands and greeted her as Senior Li. She wore white as always, cold and holy, but I could feel that her aura sat unstable and frayed. Injured again, I thought. The woman was truly born for combat. She told me softly that since I stood as a fellow disciple to Li Ya, I need not call her senior, and that I might simply address her as senior sister. I could only comply. She swept her gaze around the cave, praised my work, and offered to recommend me for jobs. Her word would win me a measure of face with the employers, she said, and keep them from treating me poorly. I answered at once that I would be grateful, thanking her warmly, since I was still saving toward 100,000 years of lifespan to push past the nascent soul realm. She nodded and told me to come back in a month, and I saluted and took my leave. After I had gone, as I later gathered from her drawn silence, she went to her bed and channeled her power to mend her injuries. Her face bled white, and she spat a mouthful of black blood onto the floor. Outside the cave, I felt her aura erupt all at once and guessed the wound had flared, but I did not slow my steps. I had no idea how to heal such things, and no wish to tangle myself deeper into her affairs. When I next saw her, the injuries had mostly closed. Under her guidance, I met 5 more outer sect disciples, so I was soon tending 7 immortal caves at once. Because every cave sat in its own state, I had to leave the valley every 3 or 4 days. To make the traveling easier, I raised my surface cultivation to the 6th level of the Qi refining realm. Each time I went out, I leaned on the sword kinesis technique, since the 5th level spiritual Qi would never have carried me there and back in a single day. I never brought out the heavenly constellation sword. Instead, I rode a plain flying sword traded from the outer sect precisely so it would draw no eyes. Summer gave way to autumn, and drifting leaves buried the valley, and after the colors faded, the winter snow drowned it in white once more. On one such day, I sat in the pavilion spilling ink across paper. I had read so much of the travels of the Azure Wanderer that I wanted to write a book of my own. On my last trip, I had learned that writing could actually earn spirit stones, though the review was brutally strict. Carrying the memory of Earth in my head, I decided to give the Taehan sect a small shock, since more spirit stones meant more seeds. I was writing with real fervor when something pricked at my senses and my brows drew together. Outside the window, the sky went dark, rolling thunderclouds surged up from the horizon, and a terrible heavenly might came down to smother the heavens, the earth, and the whole snowbound forest. Undergoing lightning tribulation, I realized, and slowly my brows eased as curiosity crept in. I was not worried, because the heavenly might hung far from Mystic Valley. Down among the trees, Dang Wu, Sohan, and Kyonjin all turned their heads from the snow clearing. Ye Ran, meditating in the forest, opened her eyes, and So Qian stepped out of his room to look up at the churning sky. Oshin sat in meditation on the mountaintop, his figure unhidden by the flying snow. His brows knotted tight. Such strong sword intent, he muttered. For though his cultivation ran low, he had come out of the Thousand Autumns Pavilion and knew a great deal. The clouds swallowed the whole sky like an ocean heaving up a storm. The forest fell into gloom, and the wind rose until the trees shrugged off sheets of snow. The heavenly might left me no heart for writing, so I rose, went downstairs and called my disciples to keep watch over the plots. An hour later, several cultivators streaked over the valley, rushing toward the source of the might before they vanished into the driving snow. The sight only wound the disciples tighter, none of them knowing what had come to pass. Not until late evening did a single clap of thunder roll across the whole of heaven and earth. I stood on the mountaintop watching the lightning flash and split far off, the bolts weaving toward one point until they formed a vast fan of light. The glare of it lit my face while my black robe snapped in the wind. The lightning tribulation was so terrible, I thought that it was little wonder I had failed the crossing so many times in my simulated cultivation. Inwardly I sighed, and the resentment I had carried for years finally dissolved. The simulations had always eaten more lifespan than reality, yet they carried the one great virtue of being safe. Looking back, I weighed what that safety had bought me, a man of 28 standing at the 9th level of the nascent soul realm. I doubted the whole Taehan sect could turn up a second like me. Afterward, I went back down to keep writing. That night the thunder ground on and on, leaving no one in Medicine Valley able to cultivate in peace. By noon the next day it still had not stopped, and the wind kept climbing as though a blizzard were bearing down on us. Now and again I led the disciples out to look after the medicinal herbs. It took 3 full days and nights before the thunder finally died. As the clouds pulled apart and sunlight spilled down at last, the disciples of Mystic Valley let out a long breath of relief. They had not been glad for even half a day when a keen pressure spread across the world, tightening every chest and setting every heart to pounding. Inside the pavilion I set down my brush, looked out the window and frowned. I could feel a powerful sword intent reaching in from the horizon, though for the moment I could not judge how far off it lay. What was he doing, I wondered? He had only just crossed his tribulation, and already he was sitting down to comprehend the sword? I could only pray the fellow would not bring harm to my Medicine Valley. His sword intent was strong, but when I quietly measured it against my own, I judged it inferior to my Grand Azure startling divine sword. After all, that sword was a thing I had forged with 2,000 years of lifespan, and how many souls in this world ever lived 2,000 years at all? Late that night, I went to the 8 Sceneries Grotto Heaven to see Gang Gyung, walking to the azure vine tree before I raised my hand in salute. Without so much as opening her eyes, she told me not to come down for a while, so that I would not be discovered by Jawa Ilgium. Jawa Ilgium. I remembered the name well, for he was Jawa Rim's father, and I had swept my lifespan probe across the 2 of them once when they flew over the valley together. His cultivation had stood then at the 9th level of the core formation realm, and after his tribulation he had climbed into the nascent soul realm. My mind moved quickly, but aloud I asked, all nerves, who this Jawa Ilgium might be. He was the one crossing the lightning tribulation these past days, she answered. She had heard from my late master that he had already made himself a name as the sword idiot of Chengho Lake. I asked, all innocent curiosity, whether the 2 of them were old acquaintances. They were indeed, she said. Years ago he had overreached himself and tried to court her as a Tao companion, and she had humiliated him so thoroughly that he became a laughingstock across the inner sect. From that day he had buried himself in the sword and shut his doors, and she never saw him again until the day her injury forced her to feign death. As she said it, she opened her eyes, looked at me, and teased with a smile. Her good disciple grandson would do well never to let himself grow too fond of anyone, she said, since fondness made a man easy to wound. I thanked her for the lesson. After that, she sat me down and began drilling me in the parasite techniques of the myriad parasite profound technique, an art that demands endless study to master. I stayed 2 hours at the Grotto Heaven, then left. 3 days later, in the early morning, I was leading the disciples through their drills. We stood on a white snow in thin clothes while the cold wind bit at us. A shriek of parting air made everyone whip their heads around. We saw the eastern peak struck by a streak of sword chi, 2 great trees on the slope shorn clean through and tumbling down the hillside. A row of standing trees caught them at last and threw up a haze of dust and snow like white mist. Looking up, I found a crack some 20 feet long carved into the mountain wall, as though a giant sword had opened it. So Han frowned and warned that this was not the first time, and that if it went on it would ruin us sooner or later. The others fretted with him, and their movements slowed. Oh, Shin sighed that a sword cultivator comprehending his Tao might need decades, and who could say how long that man would take? For once I wore no smile, and my face had gone dark because it was the herbs that gnawed at me. The day before I had carried the matter to the alchemy hall at the outer sect. Their answer was that I might move to the outer sect city for a time and simply forfeit this year's harvest, since the hall would bear none of Medicine Valley's losses. But those herbs were my treasures, every last one, and there was no letting them go. If Medicine Valley collapsed, the 8 Sceneries Grotto Heaven beneath it might be laid bare. That could not happen. My eyes flickered, and I made my decision, because while I would swallow any humiliation to save my own skin, for the sake of those herbs I could actually bring myself to fight. I told the disciples to hurry through their drills, and then cultivate on their own. We would wait 2 more days, I said, and if the man had not left, we would retreat to the outer sect for shelter. The words lit them up at once, since they too had long feared the valley's ruin. The winter day passed quickly, and night came down. On a distant mountaintop, Jawilgium sat in meditation in a gray robe, and before him stood 5 swords, each shaped differently, the very widths of their blades unlike. Snow poured across the sky, and wherever a flake touched him, it melted into a wisp of white mist, which made his whole aura all the more formidable. 1,000 feet away, on another peak, Ja Rim sat at the edge of a cliff, 3 great flags planted around him. Whenever sword chi swept past, an unseen shield rose to turn it aside so that he took no hurt. Unharmed though he was, the roar of sword chi hammering that formation had shaken him awake. He looked up at his father with envy in his eyes. They said dragons bred dragons, and he could not fathom why he had not inherited his father's aptitude for the Tao of the sword. His spiritual root was excellent, and his chi gathered faster than any of his peers, yet all he wanted was to become a fearsome sword cultivator like his father. Were it not for the sword's endless demands, his cultivation would have climbed far beyond the second level of the Foundation establishment realm. He sighed and made ready to resume his own comprehension, refusing to believe he could grasp nothing of the sword. But just as he moved to close his eyes, he saw his father rise, and the sight left him frozen. Was it over? He wondered. Israqsg stood facing his son's direction, but his gaze climbed past him toward a higher, more distant mountain. The night stretched vast and empty, no figure to be seen, yet he could feel a sword intent locking onto him. The 5 treasured swords before him began to tremble and hum, as though bracing against a formidable foe. Jawa Rim rose too and called out loudly, asking his father what had happened and whether he had succeeded. Jawa Ilgiam did not answer. Instead, he asked aloud which fellow Taoist had come, and why the visitor would not show himself. 10 miles away, I stood on a mountaintop, dressed all in white, a wooden mask over my face and spiritual power layered beneath it to keep any probing divine sense from reading me. My pale robes blurred into the snow at my back. In my right hand, I toyed with a single leaf, wisps of sword chi curling along its edge. Before ever loosing my sword intent, I had swept the land within 100 miles and confirmed that no other powerful cultivators lurked nearby. I took no pleasure in killing the innocent, but JYLGM was endangering my medicine valley, and he had to be driven off. If he wanted someone to blame, I murmured, he could blame himself for choosing the wrong place to sit. Already I was driving my cultivation technique, pouring spiritual power into the leaf. Across the way, Jawa Rim turned sharply. With only Foundation establishment cultivation, he could never make out a man 10 miles off, let alone in the dead of night with the sky choked by snow. Jawel Guillaume felt the visitor's sword intense swelling and knew the fight could no longer be avoided. He wondered aloud whether I was a spy of the demonic path. His eyes flickered as his right hand closed around one of the swords, a slender blade of crimson. At his grip, the edge burst into flame until it became the brightest thing beneath the night sky. He drew and rose, the blade cleaving the air and flinging up a wave of fire that hung across the dark. Even in this bitter cold, Jawa Rim marveled. His father was wielding the flame-devouring sword technique, and these few days of comprehension had lifted his Tao enormously. Whoever the stranger was, the son believed his father could not be beaten. Since the fellow Taoist refused to speak, Zhao Il-Guillaume declared coldly, he could only assume the visitor meant to shatter his comprehension, and he would let this frozen world witness whose sword intent stood higher. As the words fell, an explosive sword intent tore out of him. His peak shuddered, the snow gave way, and even Jawa Rim's mountain trembled. Too talkative, I whispered, so low that only I could hear, and I threw the leaf. It was as though no leaf flew from my hand at all, but a divine sword piercing through time and space. Under the dim snowfall, Zhao Il-Guillaume's sword intent gathered into an overbearing pillar of chi that stirred up the wind and snow and joined the heavens to the mountains. From within it, scorching flames rose and coiled into a fire dragon that surged upward. Jawa Rim watched dumbstruck, for he had never heard that his father's technique could reach such a height. A massive roar broke behind Jawa Rim like a thunderclap from nowhere, and he spun around on instinct. But before he had fully turned, a brilliant sword light fell across his face. His eyes flew wide as he caught the flash of it streaking over the dim horizon. That light was beyond any words to hold, and where it struck the snow it raised a vast wave of chi, as if the whole night sky were about to be run through. His mind went blank, and there was no time to think. The brilliant light tore across the dark and passed over his head, and the wind of its passing snapped his formation awake, throwing up a chi shield that shuddered on the very edge of breaking. Under his stricken gaze, the sword light slammed into Zhao Il-Guillaume's sword intent with a crushing, unstoppable weight. Zhao Il-Guillaume reacted faster than his son, yet however fast he moved, he could not match his opponent's speed. He had no time to unleash any technique and could only throw his bare sword intent up to resist. The pillar shattered in an instant, the crimson flame dragon guttered out, and his sword intent was crushed flat. His robes tore open and blood burst from his body. His eyes stretched wide, and in his pupils there hung the image of a single leaf. How is this possible? The thought flashed through him, and before he could taste fear, the leaf drove into his shoulder. A terrifying sword chi erupted and flung him backwards, punching him through one mountain after another, until he crashed at last into a forest more than 10 miles away. A hollow tunnel was carved through the night, the snow along its length flashing into mist and hanging between the peaks. On the mountaintop, Jawa Rim stood within his formation, staring toward the place his father had vanished, unable to believe his eyes. Then his legs gave out and he sank to his knees. His invincible father had actually lost, and lost without so much as a struggle. 10 miles off, I held my posture after the throw. The cold wind drove the snow against me and set my white robes billowing, and behind the mask, my eyes stayed perfectly calm. How could 100 years of his cultivation ever weigh against 2,000 years of my invested lifespan, I thought. I had even shown him mercy, aiming not for his head but his shoulder. Then I turned and left, dissolving into the snow as though I had never stood there. At dawn, I led the disciples through their exercises as if nothing had happened. Yan Jin, twisting at the waist, remarked that the snow seemed to have thinned today. O Shin gazed off and answered that it was not only the snow that had lightened, for that overwhelming sword intent had vanished too. The words set the disciples buzzing, and a hopeful chatter ran among them. Some guessed the man had already moved on to some spiritual mountain, while others warned against dropping their guard in case he was merely resting. One reminded the rest that a great cultivator fresh from tribulation would hardly need a nap. Listening to them squabble, I could not help but chuckle. I gave a false cough and told them to mind their drills, since time would show plainly enough whether that senior had gone. Privately, I only hoped no one else would ever come near to cross a tribulation, because if I ever pressed too hard again, the aftermath would not be pretty. For the next 2 days, no sword intent shrouded the heavens, and the disciples grew certain the man had left, so the valley slipped back into its rhythm. Cultivators still passed overhead now and again, and the disciples had long grown used to them. Only I knew those figures were likely combing the region over Jawa Ilgyam's injury, since I had probed one and found the 6th layer of the nascent soul realm. At nightfall, after several days apart, I went down to visit Gang Gyeong. I bowed and offered that Senior Jawa Ilgyam seemed to have departed. She was not cultivating but busy with alchemy. Without lifting her eyes from the flames beneath the pill furnace, she said he had not left at all, that he was either dead or gravely wounded. I feigned alarm and asked why, adding that the man was a great cultivator of the nascent soul realm. She rolled her eyes and retorted that being nascent soul meant little, since there were realms above it. A few days back, she said, 2 powerful sword intents had clashed, one of them far surpassing Jwa Elgium's. The fight had ended in a single instant, which meant the victor's strength dwarfed his by an enormous margin. I felt a secret glow of pleasure, but on the surface I frowned and asked whether Mystic Valley might be in danger. She told me to set my mind at ease, since several days had passed, and asked whether I would bother to stamp on an ant at the roadside. She looked calm, yet underneath she was gripped by urgency, for she had begun to suspect she had fallen out of step with the cultivation world. 70 years was enough for whole dynasties to rise and fall. She herself had needed only 40 to reach the core formation realm, so who could say what the world looked like now? She warned me that when my own day of tribulation came, I must be cautious. I should never be like Jwa Wilgyam, she said, who had likely believed no one would dare interfere with him, blind to how vicious the Taehan sect's internal strife had grown. I asked, all surprise, whether she meant the one who struck him was a Taehan cultivator. Naturally, she nodded, since great cultivators of other sects would not dare go blundering into Taehan territory. This one had disappeared at once with no second battle, marking him plainly as one of their own. You guessed exactly right, I thought. After I had acted that night, I had fled the scene at speed. The moment I reached Mystic Valley, several powerful divine senses came sweeping over me and broke me out in a cold sweat. Thank the heavens my dragon-forced primordial art ran deep enough to hide me. She had a great deal on her mind, and she began schooling me in how to carry myself through the cultivation world someday. After a long while, I finally slipped free of her lecture and went to check on the sky dragon egg. She had set the egg beneath a tree amid heaps of hay. Under the hay she had laid out countless talisman papers inked with her spells, helping the egg drink in the spiritual chi of heaven and earth all the better. I wondered idly what the sky dragon would look like once it hatched, and already I daydreamed of riding a true dragon across the mortal world. The news of Jwa Ilgium's grave injury struck harder than I had expected, and even half a month later, when I reached the outer sect, I kept hearing people speak of it. Word of a nascent soul cultivator had once been a rarity here, yet now the whole city talked of him. Before that crossing, he had been an elder of the outer sect, his strength among the very best it had. I followed the Alchemy Hall elder, Ju Chongno, to the outer sect scripture hall, which oversaw every book tower of the outer sect. Anything that flowed into the Taeyeon sect had to be registered there. Walking ahead of me, Ju Chongno turned back with a smile and said the notion of writing a book was a fine one, and that he backed it fully. If it passed, he added, he would put in a word to widen the first printing. Ever since he had profited off my azure vine fruit, he had treated me like his own junior, at least where anyone could see. I thanked him for his guidance and swore I would never forget his kindness. He stroked his beard and laughed and told me it was all far too formal, yet the smile on his face only brightened. The scripture hall was vast, no smaller than the alchemy hall. After threading corridor upon corridor, we came into a great chamber where an old man sat drinking tea by a table, rows of bookshelves visible through the side hall. Ju Chongno cupped his hands and greeted the man warmly as Elder Yu, remarking that it had been far too long. At once I loosed a lifespan probe. The reading answered on the instant. Yu Cheng of the 9th layer of the Foundation Establishment realm. His figures running 226, then 270, then 340. Yu Cheng rose to welcome him, and after a round of pleasantries the two fell to talking of the days 200 years ago, when they had joined the Taeyeon sect side by side. I stood behind Ju Chongno wearing my most earnest and curious face, and Yu Chang glanced at me now and then, plainly pleased. After half an hour of this, Zhu Qiangno came to the point. Yu Chang waved it off and told the junior to hand over his book, saying he would scan it, and if it could circulate the matter would be settled. I brought out the book. He took it, dropped his eyes to the first page and smiled at the title, Investiture of the Gods, calling it a good name. He began to leaf through it while Zhu Qiangno wandered toward the shelves, and I stood by obediently. At first Yu Chang read carelessly, but as the pages turned his spine slowly straightened. Just then a young man in white strode in and called out loudly, asking Elder Yu whether there were any books about sword cultivators. He wanted to know, he declared, who in all the Taichang world could beat the Changho sword enthusiast with a single leaf. Yu Chang raised a hand to hush him. I turned to look and, out of habit, cast a lifespan probe. Go Yu. The reading told me 8th layer of the Foundation Establishment Realm. His number's 34, then 291, then 1402. A genius, plainly, though not the first I had met, so I did not spare him a second glance. Go Yu leaned in over Yu Chang's shoulder to peer down at the book, and before long he too was lost in it. A full half hour drifted by. Zhu Qiangno walked over and asked in surprise why his brother Yu had been reading so long over a casual glance. Then he shot me a wary look, wondering what the boy had written and whether I had crossed some line. Yu Chang lifted his head, sat stunned a moment, then stood and fixed his eyes hard on me, and demanded whether I had truly written this. I nodded, thinking privately it was true enough, since one of my ancestors back on Earth had written it. Zhou Qiangno frowned and asked whether there was a problem, offering to send me home to rewrite it if it did not suit. No problem, Yu Chang answered, shaking his head, for it was brilliant. He looked at me again, declared the book fit for distribution, and praised my talent. He set my share at 30%, with 50% of the spirit stones from each copy going to the sect, and 20% to the scripture hall. I dared raise no objection and hurried to thank him, while Zhou Chang nodded, feeling that Yu Chang had done him a real favor. Smiling, Yu Chang asked whether I would use my true name as the author. I shook my head and said I would rather not, for fear of the trouble it might invite. He suggested we simply print the author as Ban An. In truth, I had first wanted to borrow the name of Xiao Zhonggrim, the man who wrote Investiture of the Gods on Earth. But knowing I would need to publish other books to scrape together some extra coin, I settled on a different name instead. Neither man read anything into it, since Ban An differed from Goan by only a surname, which struck them as natural. Afterward, Yu Chang set to lecturing me on what could and could not be written. He hinted, broadly then narrowly, that I ought to write the Taihan sect into the tale in a flattering light. The more I praised the sect, he said, the better my treatment would grow. I could only nod along, though whether I would actually do it was a decision for later. When Yu Chang finished, Go Yu leaned in eagerly and asked whether I had written any other books, and I shook my head and said this was my first. Not bad at all, he laughed, patting my shoulder, adding that he thought highly of me and that I might one day surpass even Azure Hero standing within the Taihan sect. The name caught me, and I asked whether he knew Azure Hero. He raised an eyebrow and asked whether I liked the man's travelogues too. Then he admitted he did not know him, only that he was some cultivator of the Taihan sect, and that old Yu had refused to say a word more no matter how he pressed. Yu Chang laughed heartily and towed Zhou Qiangno toward the door, saying the two should take a walk and catch up, while the youngsters chatted. The pair slipped out of the hall. Go Yu then pumped me for every detail of how I had written the book, and seeing how uncommonly old Yu treated him, I answered with patience. A full hour later, I finally followed Yu Changno out of the scripture repository. That disciple Go Yu, the elder remarked, was no simple background, since juniors whom Yu Chang doted on that way were rare. I nodded, though I had no wish to grow close to him, for men like that had a way of shattering the quiet of a peaceful life. Once we parted, I bought spiritual plant seeds and picked up a batch of clothing, and it was nightfall when I returned to Mystic Valley. The days rolled on, and another Lunar New Year came around. The second spring festival went off even more smoothly than the first, with never a snag. The mood was merrier than the year before, and I carried food to Gangyang just as I always had. I had begun counting the days, readying myself to see her off. Once she was gone, I meant to unleash every skill I owned inside the 8 sceneries grotto heaven and fill it wall to wall with spiritual flowers and plants. After the festival, I took Oshin down to the outer sect and chose 3 more utility disciples, 2 young women and 1 young man, named Yan Mei, Yang Min, and Ye Yeon. All 3 were 18 and brimming with hope for the life ahead of them in Mystic Valley. Becoming a utility disciple earned a person's spirit stones, and better yet, a chance to inherit the master's spells. I had brought Oshin along too, meaning to settle him fully into the role of head disciple so he could run errands for me in the days to come. Back at the valley, I had him lead the 3 around to meet the others, while I walked off into the northern mountain forest to lay some plans. I wanted to blanket the nearby woods in spiritual plants, for the ones I had turned in last year already ranked among the top 10 of the Outer Sex Medicine Valley. Ju Chung-no prized me all the more for it, and had raised my treatment again. Supporting 9 utility disciples was well within my means, and I even fancied recruiting more. People find it hard to rest content with what they have, and I was no different about my yearly lifespan take. If this year's growth fell short of last year's, it would gnaw at me terribly. I stood beneath a tree, swept my eyes across the forest, and began mapping the cultivation grounds in my mind. The white spirit rat came darting out of the trees, and the sight of it filled me with both dread and hope at once. I feared it would fetch some treasure, and yet I longed for it to fetch one all the same. It hopped up to my feet and spat out a jade ring. I snatched it up, tucked it into my belt to examine later, then scooped up the rat and forbade it from running off. Good work, I told it with a smile, promising it an azure vine fruit that night, and the creature seemed to understand, for it left off struggling and lay obediently in my arms. After lingering there for half an incense stick, I turned and left the forest, standing on the grass beside the cultivation grounds to wait. Before long, a whistle of parting air announced an outer sect disciple gliding in on a sword, and he touched down beside me while the others gaped. "Senior brother," he cried. He was back, and it was none other than No Guga, who had gone off to sit the outer sect assessment. Dressed now in the Taoist robe of the outer sect, he looked a wholly different man than before. I told him with a smile that I had half thought he would never come back. He scratched his head and said, "How could that be?" After receiving his foundation establishment pill, he had gone straight into secluded cultivation, and the instant it succeeded, he had raced back to share the joy. I pinched his shoulder and found his frame had grown solid. The others crowded around then, pressing him about how the foundation establishment realm felt, and he answered every question, bursting with vigor. I had first met No Guga when he was only 15, and seeing him now in his glory left nothing but gladness in my heart. The road of longevity is a lonely one, and if the people I befriended along it could each come to a good end, I would carry that many fewer regrets. His return breathed life into the valley, and Yeonmei and the other two took heart, seeing plainly that a road upward truly existed. That night I studied the jade ring. My divine sense forced its way through the restriction inside, and I found the whole thing packed with spirit stones. A windfall, I thought, and my expectations for the white spirit rat climbed higher still. No Guga stayed a month before he left, and everyone knew that with this parting it might be a lifetime before they met again. In the blink of an eye, 2 years slid by, and I was 30, though thanks to the youth-preserving pill, I still looked no older than 20. My lifespan had already climbed past 30,000 years. Mystic Valley kept growing, and the immortal caves I managed had reached 11, so my monthly lifespan income mounted steadily. Life was busy and full, yet I never once felt worn down, only fired with fighting spirit. Midsummer came with a bright moon and thin stars, and fireflies flickered through the still forest. Gang Young walked ahead of me in white, barefoot, feeling no discomfort even where her soles pressed the branches, and I followed without a word. She stopped at last, turned, and told me this was far enough. I nodded, then hesitated, and told her to take care of everything on the road ahead, since even out there she was still within Taehan territory. After so many years together, with all the spells she had taught me, it would have been a lie to claim I felt no affection. Yet set against that thread of feeling, I wished far more for her simply to be gone. She nodded, raised her right hand, and a blue-covered book appeared in it, which she tossed straight to me. "Cultivate well," she said, for when she next returned she would examine my progress. If I disappointed her, her tone turning to one a grandmother might use on a child, she would give me a proper beating. She even waved a small fist, leaving me caught somewhere between laughter and tears. Before I could answer, she vanished from where she stood, and I felt her devilish chi withdrawing at speed. In the dim forest, the corners of my mouth curled upward, and I turned toward Mystic Valley, studying the manual as I walked. The Jawi Array Record. I leafed through it and found that every page carried its own peculiar restrictions, the text laying out formations in plain words, while the methods had to be drawn out with divine sense. It set me thinking of the formations woven through the 8 sceneries grotto heaven. It was precisely because of them that so many great cultivators of the Taehan sect could soar over the valley and never once sense the azure vine tree hidden below. Though Gang Young stood only at the 9th layer of the Golden Core realm, her mastery of formations and alchemy reached far past that height. She had touched the Golden Core at 40 and had studied both arts without pause ever since, even pondering formations across the years of her feigned death. Weighing the Jawi Array Record in my hand, I felt it grow suddenly heavy. The moon set and the sun climbed. Gang Young's departure changed nothing for anyone but me, and the valley's life ran on unbroken. After leading the disciples through their exercises, I brought Ye Ran up to my pavilion. I drew out a small wooden box I had prepared long before and handed it to her. A fine square thing so finely made it looked as though it hid jewels. She stared a moment, then opened it and found a single medicinal pill resting inside. She asked what pill it was. Pouring tea for myself with a smile, I told her it was a Foundation establishment pill, made especially for her, and warned her to breathe not a word of it. If any disciple in the valley ever reached the 9th layer of the chi refining realm, I said, I would give them one as well, but she must never let them learn beforehand that I possess such pills, lest it draw trouble down on us. A Foundation establishment pill. Her eyes went wide and she moved to refuse on reflex, but I got there first and told her to rest easy. I had kept a Foundation establishment pill for myself, I said, and once she succeeded, she might one day become my backing in the outer sect. Cultivating well would be the finest repayment she could offer. I have, she began, and then her feelings tangled and the words would not come. The road of life is long, I told her earnestly, and a person is forever carrying too many thoughts, so she must never forget her greatest pursuit in this lifetime. Yi Ran had not hounded me over these years, yet whenever she looked at me, her gaze turned so tender. I sometimes overheard the other disciples murmur about it, for her feelings were plain to everyone. My own feelings for her were only those of a brother for a younger sister, nothing near the wish to share a whole life with her. In any case, my heart held room only for immortal cultivation. She nodded hard at last and said softly that I need not worry. She would cultivate with everything she had and never let me down, she promised, and she would climb high and one day look after me. Then she even blinked at me. I smiled and waved a hand to send her off. She put the pill away and turned to go, drawing the door shut behind her. But just before it closed, she said that wherever she went in the years to come, her heart would never stir for any other man, and that there would only ever be me. Then she slammed the door and fled as though pursued. With the pill in hand, Ye Ran needed only a month to succeed at Foundation establishment. That night I stood guard over her in the dark while she crossed her tribulation, and though it turned perilous, she came through safe. The day after her success, she said her farewells, and left in a great hurry. Her sudden Foundation establishment became the talk of Mystic Valley, and the disciples spun no end of theories. Some credited the pill I had given her, some an opportunity she had stumbled into, and others the simple blessing of cultivating amid these mountains. Whatever the truth, Ye Ran had gone. Beneath the scorching summer sun, I stood on the pavilion balcony, watching the disciples bustle below, and a wave of nostalgia rose in me. Zhang Hyundan, Zhang Chunshu, Li Ya, Meng Rang, No Guga, and Ye Ran had every one of them left me, and those who remained now were all my juniors. Of the ones below, the most senior was So Qian. He had given up the dream of the outer sect, yet he had not soured over it, going on living with his old cheer and finding other meanings to fill his days. I looked toward a corner of Medicine Valley, where a bamboo fence penned in a flock of ducks, and there was So Qian draped over the fence, chatting at them. These were no common ducks, for they carried a trace of a third-tier Yao beast's bloodline, and each had cost 100 low-grade spirit stones. So Qian had managed only 2, so I had paid for the other 10, which left him more grateful than ever. The flesh of low-tier Yao beasts does a cultivator good, I mused, so perhaps I ought to take up livestock farming, which could earn me both lifespan and spirit stones. The idea tempted me at once, since raising sheep and cattle across these mountains was hardly a poor plan. Yet doing so would mean forever expanding my hands, and I feared kicking up too much of a stir and drawing the sect's objections. I had even weighed slipping away to some deep mountain to do it all on my own, but I threw that out quickly. The azure vine tree could scarcely be moved, and I had no wish to cut myself off from the Taehyung sect's resource channels. Within the sect, so long as I had spirit stones enough, I could buy nearly anything, and that might not hold true beyond its borders. At worst, I would simply heap glory on the Taehyung sect in my books later. So long as I handed over herbs and Yao beast flesh in ample supply, I reasoned, why would the sect ever trouble me, since they might even lend me a hand? That settled it. In days to come, So Qian would be my beast tamer, and O Shin my head disciple over the planting, the two of them standing as my left and right protectors in Mystic Valley. The more I turned the plan over, the sounder it seemed. The wealth in the jade ring the white spirit rat had found came to the equal of 2 million low-grade spirit stones, or 200 high-grade ones. That was more than enough to let me go all out. I called So-chan over, and he came running and leapt up onto the balcony. He asked whether I needed anything. I laid out my idea, and his eyes lit brighter with every word until the two of us struck it off on the spot. In the end, I sent him down to the outer sect to draw up a written list, and he agreed and set off that same day. He had mastered the sword kinesis technique, but his spiritual power ran thin, so the round trip took 2 days with a night's rest wedged in. 3 days on, he came back and handed me the finished paper, chattering without pause. It turned out he had run into No Guga at the outer sect, and No Guga had walked him through the Yao beasts in person, and spared him no end of trouble. After talking it through, I decided we would buy 50 young beasts first to test the waters. Only an order that large would move the outer sect's beast hall to ship them all the way to Mystic Valley. So Cheon rested a day, then set out with the spirit stones I gave him. Dang Wu and Sohan going along. Both had climbed to the 5th level of the Qi refining realm, and the larger the party, the stronger its aura. Were it not for a batch of herbs on the verge of harvest, I would have gone myself, wary of being cheated. But no such thing happened, since the Taehan sect was after all a righteous sect. 5 days later, the three returned on their swords, and trailing behind came 3 two-horned white eagles with wingspans near 50 feet across. Cultivators rode on the eagles' backs, and the great claws gripped cages full of hornless lambs, their flight steady thanks to the talisman papers pasted across the cages. Once everyone had landed, I stepped forward to give my thanks, and though the 3 medicine hall disciples showed little warmth, they were not unpleasant, and after a few courtesies they left. These sheep cost me 1,000 low-grade spirit stones, I told Sochion, clapping his shoulder and warning him to tend them well. Not just spirit stones, I thought, but my very life. Once these lambs matured, they would hold the strength of the 1st tier, a match for the 3rd level of the Qi refining realm, though they could never grow the human sort of spiritual wit. So Chion nodded gravely, then scratched his head, and asked whether we might recruit 2 more utility disciples to help him. Get the others to lend a hand first, I told him, and recruit fresh disciples in half a year. Since my storage pouch was running a touch tight, he beamed and thanked me. In truth, I had spirit stones to spare, but I feared standing out too much, so I chose to rein myself in for 6 months. Back in the pavilion, everyone in the valley came running to gawk at the 1st-tier sheep Yao beasts. For the people who spent their days among flowers and plants, the sheep felt like a marvel. I set myself to writing the next volume of Investiture of the Gods. Yu Chang of the Scripture Hall had prodded me over it several times, and the moment had come to deliver. Far away, in a certain courtyard, the white-haired Jua Ilgiam sat beneath a tree with a leaf pinched in his right hand and his brows drawn tight. Compared to the man who had crossed his tribulation a few years back, he had aged badly. His edge dulled away. He no longer carried himself like a great cultivator of the nascent soul realm. Ja Rim walked in, caught sight of his father, and marched over to snatch the leaf from his hand. How much longer, he demanded angrily, did his father mean to wallow like this? And he flung the leaf to the ground and ground it under his heel. Jawa Ilgiam looked up, his eyes as still as water, and answered that he was not wallowing. Ja Rim shot back that his father sat staring at a leaf all day. How long had he been staring? The son demanded. And how long since he last gathered chi or tempered his sword intent at all? Thinking of the grievances he had swallowed over the years, Jawa Rim's anger surged until he could barely hold it in. Jawa Ilgiam lowered his head to pick the leaf back up. He asked in turn why his son had once sat racking his brains over a sword, without gathering chi either. Did gripping a sword somehow make a man more diligent than gripping a leaf? Jua Rim began, and there he choked, his face going red, and he ground out that a sword was a sword and a leaf was a leaf. He had sat withered because he could not reach the sword Tao, he said. But his father was different, and he asked whether the man truly meant to chase some Tao of the leaf. But the flying leaf sword immortal had beaten him with a single leaf. Jua Elgium said, so did his son suppose the leaf in that man's hand had not been a sword. That is different, Jua Rim protested. True sword Tao is never bound to any one sword, his father answered softly, his gaze settling back on the leaf. Jawa Rim cursed under his breath and drew a book from his storage pouch. Father should look at this, he said, a book called Investiture of the Gods that had spread through the cultivation world these past 2 years. It circulated among many sects, with some claiming it recorded the great cultivation war of the ancient age. Jawa Ilgiam did not stir. Jawa Rim set the book down at his father's feet and turned to go. No sooner had he stepped out of the courtyard than he pulled a second copy of Investiture of the Gods from his own storage pouch. Jawa Ilgiam sat staring at nothing. How long passed I cannot say, but in the end he could not help blinking, and his eyes drifted, almost against his will, to the book lying on the ground. Autumn came, and Mystic Valley turned to yellow. In the pavilion I sat drinking tea with Li Ya, who talked without pause, a book in his hand. It was Investiture of the Gods. For 2 years now the Taehan sect had been the center of every conversation, he said. First came the flying leaf sword immortal who had felled the nascent soul Changho sword fanatic with a single leaf, and won fame across the cultivation world. And second came this very book. The cultivation tales inside it were too magnificent for words, he went on. Its incredible spells had set every sect debating, some even swearing it might be a true account out of the ancient age. Listening to him rave, I frowned. Was it truly so popular? My own cut had hardly been much. Had the scripture hall skimmed the difference, or were the other sects simply not reading the genuine version? On second thought, of course, how could the cultivation world ever trouble itself over copyright? Li Ya went on for a long while before sighing that he could not guess who this Ban-An was, a talent of the First Order. He dearly wished he could meet the man, he said, since even intersect disciples and direct disciples were said to be reading it. I asked, all curiosity, whether it was really so remarkable, and said I would have to see whether it measured up to the travels of the Azure Wanderer. He scoffed that a book of that low sort could never stand beside Investiture of the Gods, and I only smiled. He put the book down, drained his tea in a single swallow, and told me he was leaving to train abroad, and that he doubted he would return for 10 years. For him, 10 years was nothing, but for his junior brother Go, it was another matter, so he had come especially to say it to my face. I was not surprised. How could any cultivator sit in the sect for a lifetime, when they must always go out to temper themselves and chase opportunities? I asked, casually, whether he had a destination in mind. He smiled and said he did. A great cultivator of the soul transformation realm had surfaced in Jeju, far to the south, a sword cultivator nearing the end of his lifespan who wished to choose a fitting successor before he died. Li Ya meant to go and try his luck. Soul transformation, I echoed, feigning ignorance, and asked what sort of realm that was, and how many levels above the nascent soul it stood. He laughed and explained that the soul transformation realm lay just above the nascent soul, for were it many levels higher, the man would never have appeared in Taechang at all. There was far more to this land than the Taechang imperial dynasty, he said, and across the sea lay a still wider world. Without the nascent soul realm, though, one could scarcely hope to cross to it. He stood and smiled in triumph, telling me that when he returned he would be the successor of a soul transformation great cultivator. By then I might have to call him senior brother, he added, and perhaps he would even show me the spells of the soul transformation realm. With that he turned to the windowsill, leapt out, and flew off on his sword. I looked at the footprints he had left on the sill and raised an eyebrow. The soul transformation realm was it. I would simply have to reach it before Li Ya came home. After Li Ya left, I threw myself into building up Mystic Valley, and my lazy afternoons dried up fast. The culprits were those young demon beast sheep, an absolute menace from the day they could walk. By 4 months old, they tore through the mountain forests as if the slopes were flat ground. They ran quick as the cheetahs I remembered from my old life on Earth. If every soul in the valley had not been a cultivator, the whole flock would have bolted over the ridge and vanished. So I dug into the Jami Array record that Gangkyong left behind. I learned a handful of low-level restrictions just to seal the sheep pen. Once the 6th month came, I sent Oshin and Sochan down to the outer sect. They recruited 2 more utility disciples, a boy named Jin Hong and a girl named Gyan Soa. Their aptitudes were thoroughly mediocre, which pleased me more than any prodigy could. That brought the number of utility disciples in Mystic Valley up to 10, and the days turned lively from dawn to dusk. Time slipped past like an arrow loosed from the string. 3 years blinked by before I could catch my breath. It was autumn once more, so Cheon was patrolling the various zones, a long orderly column of ducks waddling in his wake. On the peaks ringing Medicine Valley, disciples sat cross-legged absorbing chi. The forest shuddered now and then from Dangwu and Sohan chasing down the runaway sheep. I walked out of the western forest with a smile tugging at my mouth. I had just harvested another batch of spiritual plants, and the take was several hundred years of lifespan. That nudged me steadily toward the 100,000 mark I had been dreaming about. My current lifespan already sat at 80,000 years. Across those 3 years I had banked nearly 50,000. Most of it came from the spiritual plants I had nursed for so long, which had finally reached maturity. About 10,000 more came from quietly managing the immortal caves of outer sect disciples on the side. Just then Gyan Jin came bounding out of the trees with a bamboo basket on her back. She hurried to my side and asked whether I would teach her alchemy today. A withered leaf sat crooked on her head, and the hair by her cheeks was mussed. I laughed and told her she could learn, but only with her own spiritual plants, since spending her own stock would keep her careful. She had heard once that I had swallowed a youth-preserving pill. Ever since then, she had latched onto alchemy like a burr, pestering me for almost half a year. She announced that she had already prepared everything. Then she hopped and skipped beside me like a girl who intended never to grow up. A ripping sound tore across the sky above Mystic Valley. I glanced up out of habit and let a lifespan probe drift toward the source. Another nascent soul realm cultivator. This year alone, more than 10 of them had already passed over Mystic Valley. The pattern left me faintly uneasy, as if some enormous event were gathering just beyond the horizon. Even the old world outer sect assembly had not drawn this many nascent soul figures across my little patch of sky. So I made a quiet resolution. I needed to push the Dragon Force Divine Primordial Art further and soon. If some great cultivator far beyond the nascent soul realm ever drifted overhead and saw through my disguise, my peaceful life would end in an instant. The trouble was that the technique's lifespan gains had been shrinking year after year. These days it was good for a single year every half year, and 10 more years would strip it of any value. Afterward I took Kyon Jin back to my pavilion and spent the afternoon walking her through the fundamentals of alchemy. It was deep in the night when I slipped into the 8 Sceneries Grotto Heaven. Ever since Gang Gyong departed, I had explored the other 6 cave passages as well. At the end of each I found corpses just like Meng Rang, all refined by Zheng Hiandan and Gang Yang, They had used different parasite techniques drawn from the myriad parasite mystic art. Those parasite corpses were a problem for another day, so I left them untouched for now. I walked all the way to the azure vine tree, lifted the hem of my robe, and settled down to meditate. At that moment, a black shadow dropped from the branches and dove straight into my arms. It was a little black dragon, its body slender and roughly 2 feet long. A pair of curling horns crowned its head, and fine whiskers framed its mouth. Small black scales sheathed its length, and its 4 claws were needle-sharp. It looked exactly like the dragons of ancient legend, save for the color. This was the sacred beast of the Goho sect, the Sky Dragon. While I stroked it, I checked its lifespan and read the figures off in my mind. It was 1 year old, its current ceiling stood at 965 years, and its potential stretched to 18,000. The number had climbed again. When the Sky Dragon first hatched, it carried only 500 years of lifespan. In a single year, that figure had nearly doubled, exactly as one would expect from a Tier 9 potential demon beast. I could not help smiling as I recalled how it had taken me for its master the previous year. The newborn had bitten me outright, which annoyed me enough to fling it away. Then it snuggled pitifully against me and rubbed at my sleeve until my anger melted. My sense was that it had not truly recognized me as a master at all. Through some reading of our blood, it had simply decided who counted as its family. What we shared was a kind of soul resonance, letting me read its stray thoughts. Still, it gave me no power to command its life or death. A sky dragon serves a single master for its whole life. Beneath the violent nature, it was fiercely loyal and deeply affectionate. I told it to go and eat, then drew a slain demon beast sheep from my storage pouch. I had killed the sheep only the previous morning, and it had paid out a mere 3 years of lifespan. The dragon's eyes brightened as it seized the carcass and flapped off to the side. The sheep was several sizes larger than the little dragon. Even so, it hoisted the thing with its claws as easily as if the corpse weighed nothing. I brought up my attribute panel, fixed on the cultivation technique column, and poured 2,000 years of lifespan into the Dragon Force Divine Primordial Art. This technique masked my cultivation and my aura, and it formed the bedrock of my survival. I treated it as more precious than even the Divine Wood Pure Yang art. The system confirmed the investment for evolution and cultivation. Then the readouts began marching across my vision, one after another. I had cultivated the technique for 10 years, and heaven and earth spiritual chi tempered my body until my chi and blood grew stronger. At 100 years, the tempering deepened, and my flesh strengthened further still. At 200 years, the art reached its pinnacle realm. At 400 years, I captured the true meaning of the earth. The technique returned to simplicity and advanced into the Earth Vein Imperial Chi art. At 1500 years, I sensed the aura of the Earth's rules, and that art broke its limits and became the mysterious Yellow Dragon Chi art. At 1800 years, my understanding matured into thorough mastery. At 2000 years, my comprehension reached its very peak, and I awakened a divine ability called Mysterious Yellow Dragon Might. The technique had leapt 2 full stages and gifted me a divine ability besides. I was so overjoyed that I felt my luck this time had been extraordinary. A vast flood of memory poured into my mind, and I sank deep into the boundless Tao techniques. The sky dragon paused over its mutton and turned its head, jewel-bright eyes gleaming with curiosity. Wisps of green chi rose from the grass beneath me and circled my body. My breathing shifted on its own, until a faint dragon's roar rose from somewhere near my chest. The mysterious yellow dragon chi art draws on the mysterious yellow chi of the earth to temper the body. It merges one's flesh with the nature of heaven and earth. That so-called roar is really the sound of the earth itself resonating. A full 2 hours passed before I surfaced, and the moment I opened my eyes, I frowned. Every flower and blade of grass around me had shriveled to brown husks. I shot to my feet and swept my gaze across the spiritual plants of the grotto heaven. Only after a careful scan did I let out a long breath of relief. The withered things were all common weeds, and the spiritual flowers and plants had escaped serious harm. I could not afford to be so careless again. Whether refining a technique or forcing a breakthrough, I would have to leave the grotto heaven, so I would not bleed its spiritual chi dry. Then I sat again, reviewed the mysterious yellow dragon chi art, and circulated my chi along its prescribed path. The method asked me to condense a single mouthful of mysterious yellow dragon chi, so that my body might merge with nature. The sky dragon had eaten its fill and lay sleeping beside the sheep, and nothing remained but the sound of the wind. In the early morning, I walked down from my pavilion. I had changed into a green robe, my black hair tied loosely behind my head, with 2 long strands left by my ears. I looked every bit the elegant, otherworldly cultivator, which was exactly the pose I wanted. My body had not fully adapted to the mysterious yellow dragon chi art, but I felt no urgency since a month of nightly practice would settle it. The divine ability that arrived with the art needed no separate cultivation. The dragon might would take shape on its own the moment the dragon chi was born. It was nothing less than the might of heaven and earth, made manifest to overawe common folk. I called the disciples out for their morning exercises, and everyone could tell I was in usually high spirits. Hyunjin asked what had made me so happy. I told them, still moving through the forums, that it was only a book I had read the night before. It was called Investiture of the Gods, and they were all welcome to borrow it from the library sometime. So Cheon's eyes lit up. He explained that nearly everyone in the outer sect owned a copy, and that the book supposedly recorded ancient secrets of the cultivation world. The others crowded around him, badgering him for details, while I let my mind keep turning over the new technique. Through the following month, I cultivated the mysterious yellow dragon chi art every night. At last, I condensed a mouthful of mysterious yellow dragon chi in my abdomen, raising my concealment to an entirely new level. A wave of ease washed over me, since now I could keep lying low with a clear conscience. That year passed as plainly as the ones before it, and for me, plainness was the finest outcome. The winter snow had only just begun to melt, when Mystic Valley welcomed the new year again. All the disciples busied themselves preparing for the spring festival. I was reading the travels of the Azure Wanderer beneath a tree, thoroughly engrossed. Gyeonjin drifted over with her hands behind her back and leaned in. She asked what I wanted to eat the following night, since she meant to cook it for me. Without lifting my eyes, I said anything at all would do, and that I would happily eat whatever she made. Curious, she craned in to see the cover, but I blocked her. I warned with mock severity that if she dawdled and ruined the next night's festival, I would stop teaching her alchemy. She pouted at once and had no choice but to turn and go. I caught her muttering under her breath about how I was reading improper books again, and my mouth twitched. I still had no idea who had spread that rumor and ruined my reputation. By now, every disciple in Medicine Valley knew I favored the travels of the Azure Wanderer. None dared say it to my face, yet they teased me plenty in private. So I stood, tucked the book into my robe, and swore that starting today I was quitting. I walked out of the courtyard meaning to inspect the zones. Then my gaze snagged on the mouth of the valley, and my brows drew together. A man in a white robe was strolling in without a care, perhaps in his 30s, his face handsome and his bearing extraordinary. What unsettled me was that I could not sense the faintest trace of his aura, so I quietly loosed a lifespan probe at him. The reading gave his name as Lee Hyondo. It placed him at the 8th layer of the soul transformation realm, with his age at 230. His current lifespan set at 899, and his potential reached 3020. A maximum lifespan of only 3,000 years left me startled. It was the first time I had ever met someone with such aptitude, and he stood at the 8th layer of soul transformation besides. Still, that ceiling ran lower than I would have guessed for such a realm. I doubted a true soul transformation cultivator could be limited to a mere 899 years, so I suppose some injury had gnawed his lifespan down. I walked toward him, turning it over in my head, guessing he might be a high-ranking figure of the Taeon sect. Since he was suppressing his aura, I could not afford to look too respectful. If I let slip that I had seen through him, he would surely cling to me for answers, or take me for a spy of the demonic path. Lee Hyeondo wandered into the valley, admiring the gardens along the way. I stepped up, cupped my hands, and introduced myself as Go-An, master of Mystic Valley, before asking his name and purpose. He fixed his gaze on me, his eyes cool and pressing down with a tremendous weight. Then he smiled, and the pressure vanished as if it had never existed. He told me gently that he was called Hyeondo, and that he hailed from Chengju. He had come to the Taehan sect to visit his child. The road had been long and wearing, he said, so he hoped to borrow the valley for a few days to rest and recover his spiritual chi. How could I possibly refuse? I agreed at once and called Socheon over to arrange a room. I was careful not to stare. A man surnamed Lee, come to visit a child, might well belong to the imperial dynasty. He had passed over every other Medicine Valley in the outer sect to come straight to mine, so this was almost certainly tangled up with Leah. So Cheon led Lee Hyeondo to an empty house and apologized that the room was plain, telling him to speak up if he needed anything. Lee Hyeondo remarked that he had seen sheep and herders in the mountains on his way in. He asked why a Medicine Valley kept so many sheep, so Cheon hid nothing. He explained that the valley had once grown only herbs, but that his own spiritual route was too limited for the outer sect. His senior brother had learned he loved raising livestock and made his wish come true. On top of that, the sheep earned spirit stones that helped more disciples cultivate and reach the outer sect sooner. When Lee Hyeondo asked whether that senior brother was the valley master, Socheon confirmed it. He swore his senior brother was the best person in all the world, then heaped on praise. Lee Hyeondo's interest visibly deepened, and he began fishing for more of my deeds. I was inspecting the garden through all of this, and my lips curled upward. It seemed I had not spoiled that silly boy for nothing. Whether Lee Hyeondo turned out to be Leah's kin, or a Taehyun elder, a better reputation could only shield me. Then a colder thought crossed my mind. What if Lee Hyeondo came from the Thousand Autumns Pavilion? A chill crawled up my spine and my smile froze. Better safe than sorry, I told myself, resolving to handle him with the utmost caution. His arrival stirred the curiosity of the other disciples, since visitors to Mystic Valley were rare. He did not emerge again after settling in, as though he truly meant only to recover his spiritual chi. Because of him, I did not dare visit the Grotto Heaven, and I stayed obediently in my pavilion for the night. Early the next morning, I led the disciples in their exercises as usual. Lee Haeondo came out to watch when he heard the noise, and Socheon greeted him warmly. I merely nodded at him and made no show of avoiding him. He paid little mind at first, but as he watched, the drills seemed to catch his interest. Afterward, I dismissed the disciples, drew a book from my robe, and began flipping through it as I walked toward the pavilion. I was determined not to let his presence upend the rhythm of my days. He caught up before I reached the door and asked with a smile what I was reading. I turned, lifted the book, and told him it was Investiture of the Gods, then asked whether he had read it. His smile widened as he claimed he had read it and could recite it backward. When I called him a fellow enthusiast, he laughed that he had felt a certain kinship the instant he saw me. He proposed that we discuss the book. His words dripped with pretense, but I could only agree with a smile. So I invited him upstairs, and once he was seated, I boiled water and made tea, lighting the fire with spiritual chi. Lee Haeondo swept his gaze over the room and asked what I made of King Ju. He was testing me before the tea had even steeped. With my back to him dropping leaves into the cup, I gave my answer. Read purely as a story, the man was cruel and inhuman, yet a closer look made his actions seem oddly illogical. He sighed his agreement. His first reading had left him thinking King Ju merely stupid and vicious, but a second pass had troubled him. In the book's world, immortals and gods truly existed, and King Ju could not have been ignorant of that. So daring to desecrate the holy statue of Yoa hardly read like the conduct of a sane monarch. And Yoa herself, lofty and mighty as she was, had not struck down the mortal who defiled her. Instead, she loosed a fox spirit to corrupt the emperor's heart and plunged the world into chaos, which struck him as poor behavior for any true immortal. I turned, carried the cup over, and set it before him. Then I smiled and allowed that the tale held many unreasonable points. It was, after all, a story humans had invented, and contradictions written in for the sake of interest were forgivable enough. Since I could not pin down his identity, I kept my stance carefully ambiguous. He shook his head and answered that the story might be false, yet the world it revealed was real. It was a world where gods hovered 3 feet above one's head, and humans could scarcely overcome heaven. I had not expected him to read Investiture of the Gods that way. He then asked how the story might change if King Ju had been powerful enough to tower over every immortal and god sect. I thought a moment. The final battle, I said, would no longer pit them against sect leader Toncheon, but against King Ju himself. He seemed taken aback and could not help chuckling, then lifted his cup and blew the steam aside. Since I could not read that smile, I chose to hold my tongue. After a sip of tea, he began asking after the planting in Mystic Valley, even probing certain cultivation details, all of which I answered. Then he asked whether growing flowers and grass, rather than chasing an immortal life, had been a helpless compromise or a thing I genuinely loved. I smiled ruefully and told him it was both. People pursued different ends, and immortality was not the sole meaning of a life. Of course I would chase it too, I added, if my aptitude had been excellent. He teased that I was a genuinely interesting man who held nothing back. I answered with a shrug that my whole life came down to 4 words: finding joy in suffering. My suspicion had only grown that he belonged to the Thousand Autumns Pavilion and meant to sound out my loyalty to Mystic Valley. He set down his cup and asked what I thought of the current emperor and whether he was another King Ju. The question yanked me sideways. The topic had lurched all the way to the emperor of the Taechang dynasty. I wondered whether he might not be a pavilion man at all, but instead a relative of Li Ya. My mind raced as I answered that I knew little, having been a mere servant before joining the Taehan sect. Buried in this medicine valley, I heard even less of the outside world now. Then I asked whether the emperor had done something. He smiled and said it was nothing of the sort. The man had simply sat the throne so long that court and commoners alike murmured about him. The secular world felt an emperor should not linger too long on the throne, lest he grow muddled, and the cultivation world feared far more that an emperor might cultivate his way to the Tao and raise imperial power above the sects. That answer made me nervous, since it touched too many strata of the world for me to speak freely. Seeing my hesitation, he prodded me to say whether it was better for an emperor to reign for a long span, or to change out every few decades. Knowing he stood at the 8th layer of soul transformation, I did not dare refuse to answer. After a pause, I offered that it depended on the ruler's character. A virtuous emperor who governed well caused no harm by staying, but if such a man still held many years of lifespan yet abdicated to a muddled son, that would be a catastrophe for the common people. They cared nothing for the eternity of a dynasty and lived barely 100 years, and they would curse the abdication if it condemned them to misery. He laughed again, and I could plainly feel his mood lift. Then the pieces clicked. A relative of Li Ya, surnamed Li, first steering me toward King Ju and then toward the reigning emperor. I had heard at the Ji clan that the emperor of the Taechang dynasty also cultivated, and that he had held the throne for 200 years. He said that my words made sense, and that he truly ought to stop listening to distant voices. He should go and see the lives of the common people with his own eyes. The instant those words left him, my face changed and I blurted out my question. Was he the current emperor? I was already starting to rise from my seat. He raised a hand and a heavy pressure pressed me back down, and I let it, since resisting might have exposed my cultivation. He told me softly to keep my voice down. I need not treat him as the emperor, but only as a father, and I could simply call him uncle. His smile was warm and held not a shred of imperial majesty, yet I had no idea how to respond. An emperor at the 8th layer of the soul transformation realm was trouble of the largest possible size. He told me to bring out the heavenly constellation, and I drew the heavenly constellation sword from my storage pouch at once. The moment his eyes landed on it, they turned complicated, and he lifted the scabbard and stroked it gently. I remembered what Li Ya had told me. The heavenly constellation sword was the blade the emperor had once gifted his mother, and it had passed to Li Ya after she died. Watching Li Hyondo's face now, I found myself imagining all the grievance and love and hatred that must have run between him and Li Ya's mother. After a long while, he set the sword down and pushed it toward me. Of everyone in the Taehyun sect, he said, Li Ya was closest to me, and he had heard I even saved the boy's life. He told me to keep the sword, that he bestowed it on me, and that from this day forward I was its master. He was not finished. He announced a plan to establish a medicine valley right beside the Taehyun sect, stocked with many high-grade herbs, and he wanted me to manage it. He promised he would never treat me unfairly. Carrying me to foundation establishment, or even core formation, would be no difficult matter for him. But there was one thing I had to understand. On the surface I would remain a disciple of the Taehyun sect, yet my heart would belong to him. Li Hyondo finished speaking and watched me with a smile, waiting for my choice, and I sat there stunned. The Emperor wanted me as a spy too, which meant he was forcing me into life as a triple agent. This was not remotely what I wanted, but the crux was that I could not refuse. Both his cultivation and his station towered over mine. To decline was to invite trouble on the spot, while to accept was to sign up for endless trouble down the road. And yet the thought of those high-grade herbs sent my heart thumping faster than I could control. I asked hesitantly whether I had any room to refuse at all. He answered easily that I did. If I refused, he would simply erase my memory of the day as though we had never met. So I asked, half helpless, why he had chosen me, when a man of his status could poach a far worthier outer sect disciple without effort. He shook his head and said he was not out to poach anyone in particular. My close bond with Li Ya made me the natural choice, and my mediocre aptitude put him more at ease, since he could easily satisfy every need a man like me might have. Then he added, in a light and teasing tone, a little jab of his own, the world did not want the emperor to live forever, and he in turn did not want the master of his medicine valley to live forever either. The man certainly fancied himself a wit. All I could say was that, given the circumstances, I had no choice but to agree. He smiled that decades from now, looking back, I would not regret today's decision. I could not help asking whether His Majesty had always kept an eye on senior brother Li. He put on a straight face and told me the matter was settled, so I should drop the title of Majesty and call him uncle, which felt more like family. Seeing he was not testing me, I called him uncle, and he admitted he kept quite a few pawns scattered through the Taehyun outer sect. Of course he knew Li Ya's situation. I had always assumed Li Ya was on bad terms with his father, yet clearly that was not the case. I began to wonder whether some misunderstanding lay between them. I wanted to put in a word for Li Ya, but held my tongue. This emperor before me longed to live forever, and such a man's feelings toward his princes had to be tangled. Even if he loved his son, he surely harbored suspicion of him. What crown prince wishes to remain a crown prince forever? And what prince holds no secret desire for the throne? A wave of feeling moved through me. I had once thought Li Ya and Li Hyonyu simply blessed with raw talent, but seeing Li Hyonyu made the truth plain. Their gifts flowed straight from bloodline legacy. 230 years old and already at the 8th layer of soul transformation, he might well have broken into that realm before he was even 100. Which was outrageous beyond words. Most striking of all, he had cultivated a secret technique to hide his aura. Without my lifespan probe, I never could have seen through him. Very likely the court and the cultivation world could not either, which was exactly how he had cultivated in peace all this time. He went on to ask about affairs in the valley, growing curious about the spring festival the disciples kept mentioning. I answered with the same explanations I used for everyone else. He grew so taken with the idea that he decided to join in that very day, and naturally I could not refuse. Half an hour later, the two of us walked down the attic stairs to prepare the festival alongside the disciples, whose laughter and joy soon infected even him. When night fell, I brought out the firecrackers I had made myself, and the valley filled with bursts of light and crackling reports. Firelight played across Lee Haeondo's face as he beamed and even drank with Sochan. It grew impossible to connect him with the emperor of the Taechang dynasty. Dang Wu, So-han, and the others had prepared a whole program of storytelling, sparring, and juggling, and the merriment carried on well past midnight. At noon the next day, I saw Lee Haeondo off. 2 more years, and how I found myself looking forward to them, since he had said he would send someone to collect me for the new Medicine Valley when the time came. I meant to reach 100,000 years of lifespan inside those 2 years, and then break through to the soul transformation realm. No, I needed to surpass it. I would never rest easy unless I stood stronger than Lee Haeondo. Keeping company with a monarch was like keeping company with a tiger. I could not gamble my life on him never one day deciding to turn on me. I watched the direction he had gone and puzzled over why an emperor would come to the outer sect alone. Perhaps the child he truly wished to visit was Lee Hyunyu, since Lee Ya had once told me she was Lee Hyundo's favorite. I did not dwell on it, and I turned back into the valley to plant more herbs. Spring gave way to summer, and I welcomed my 34th year in the warm season. On this day I saw off Du Ya, who had come to request herbs. At the mouth of the valley, Du Ya looked back and told me the herbs I supplied had been plentiful. Young Master Ji-Rim was very satisfied. Soon, he said, someone would deliver Foundation Establishment medicinal pills to help me reach that realm early. Once I became a true outer sect disciple, Ji-Rim would arrange for me to keep running this Medicine Valley. Then he turned and left, stepping onto his sword and vaulting over the forested slopes. I shook my head and laughed, since Lee Haeondo had said much the same when I saw him off at the start of the year. I would have to keep my distance from the Ji clan in the future. They might one day plot against the Taehyun sect and come demanding my help. The sect was powerful, yet the strength of the great families ran beyond measure. Dynasties rise and fall and sects perish, but certain families endure forever, and the Ji clan was one. I could only sigh, since all I wanted was to tend my grass and flowers, yet so many people kept lining up to win me over. I walked into the nearby forest and found someone practicing his sword there, and it was So-han. He had reached the 7th layer of the Chi refining realm by now, ranking behind only me and Dangwu in the valley. Dangwu trained his legwork while So-han trained the blade. But the swordsmanship he usually drilled had come from Lee Ya and could hardly be called profound. I watched his practicing figure from a distance, torn over whether to guide him. He was diligent in his work and his cultivation both, and I could find no fault in him. Then something caught my eye. What he was practicing was not the Lee family 7 swords at all. Looking closer, I realized the sword art he displayed was one I had never seen, so this boy had stumbled into a chance encounter of his own, and I had no idea when. Curious, I deliberately trod on a scatter of dead leaves to make a sound. So-han sensed my approach, stopped at once, turned and saluted me. I asked with a smile why he trained so bitterly at the sword, when entering the outer sect depended on cultivation instead. He scratched his head and said he was in no hurry to enter the outer sect, because he wanted to learn the way of the blade first. When I asked why he thought that way, he answered that outer sect life demanded performing tasks. Insufficient strength, he said, would only cut off his own future. His answer pleased me, since this boy suited my taste. I asked whether the swordsmanship had been passed down through his family. He nodded, saying it was his father's art, but so profound that he had only recently begun to grasp it. I told him his father must have been formidable. I had seen many exquisite sword arts in the outer sect, and none matched what he had just shown. He shook his head and said his father had been a mere cripple, blind and without a single spell for as long as he could remember. The man had died of illness when he was 7, and later he had found this secret manual tucked in the bundle. As he spoke, he drew a sword manual from his robe and handed it straight to me. I took it, glanced at the title, and raised my eyebrows a fraction. Heaven-hating divine sword. It was a strange name, and the instant I read it, I half wanted to expel So-han from Mystic Valley. The boy was plainly carrying a grudge against the whole world. I flipped through it quickly. With my true cultivation at the 9th layer of the Nascent Soul Realm, I could memorize it all at a glance. Whether he could ever master it, though, hinged on his own comprehension of the Tao of the sword. I returned the manual and mused aloud that the swordsmanship was indeed exquisite, yet its mind cultivation technique struck me as somewhat sinister, and I asked whether he truly meant to practice it. The art demanded using sword chi to temper the internal organs, inflicting unimaginable pain, and some of its methods eluded even my sight. With my attainment in the Tao of the sword, I could conclude the technique was deeply demonic. So-han stared, then asked whether I thought he should not practice it. I shook my head and told him I only worried it might bring him pain. I could not truly understand his feelings when I knew nothing of his past. Whether to practice it was his to decide, I said. If he chose not to, he could remain in Mystic Valley as long as he liked, because he would always be my disciple. He was visibly moved. He stuffed the heaven-hating divine sword back into his robe and nodded hard. I drew out a book of my own, the latest volume of Investiture of the Gods, which Du Ya had given me. Ji-Rim was obsessed with the series, he had explained, and had gotten all his attendants hooked as well. I handed Sohan the volume he had wanted and turned to leave, and he held it with a smile spreading across his face. Back in Medicine Valley, I began quietly studying my other utility disciples. First Li Ya, then Oshin, and now Sohan, each one saddled with an unusual background. Mystic Valley was beginning to feel far too mysterious. Something about the pattern felt wrong. Half an hour later, though, I walked back to my attic having found no trouble in the rest of them, and my heart settled. On reflection, it made sense. Whoever managed to enter the cultivation world tended to carry an extraordinary background, each of them a protagonist in his own eyes. Late that night, I slipped down into the 8 Sceneries Grotto Heaven. After playing with the Sky Dragon for half an hour, I drew the Heavenly Constellation Sword and began working through the Heaven-Hating Divine Sword. More skills would never weigh a man down, so I meant to drill it until it registered on my attribute panel. For a while, the wind whistled beneath the azure vine tree, and that whistle was really the song of my blade cutting the air. The Sky Dragon watched from several feet off, my sword posture mirrored in its eyes. At the end of summer, I traveled to the outer sect city. I went first to the Alchemy Hall to hand over the year's herb harvest, then to the Book Collection Hall to submit my manuscript. Ever since Investiture of the Gods caught fire, Elder Yu Chang had prized me highly, always receiving me alone for fear the news might leak. He told me bluntly that he dreaded my name becoming known. The demonic path might then abduct me and cost the Book Collection Hall a fortune in spirit stones, and his frankness only made me more cautious. With business done, I went to visit Noguga, who was delighted and invited me to find Ye Ron together. As it happened, she was in the city too. Not every outer sect disciple built an immortal cave beyond the walls. The cost ran high, and most preferred to live within the city and enjoy its spiritual chi. In the courtyard, the three of us sat down, and as Noguga poured my wine, he leaned in with a hushed, mysterious air. Something enormous, he said, had happened in the Taeon sect. I asked with a smile what the great event was, though I had already felt the mood turn strange, thick with an undefinable tension. Yi Ran spoke up and explained that the sect leader was locked in a power struggle with a certain elder. Not long ago, the emperor had come to the Taeyon sect and chosen that elder's personal disciple as imperial preceptor. He had granted the man a first-rank immortal official post and proclaimed it to the world. The move had swelled the morale of the elder's faction, who had since taken to spreading unflattering rumors about the sect leader. Noguga, Sword having been beaten to the news, hurried to add his own share. The sect leader's style was domineering and had offended plenty of elders. Over the years, disciples had repeatedly died, and the demonic path had repeatedly invaded the lands beyond the outer sect. Many elders blamed the sect leader, so with the emperor now backing his rivals, chaos was inevitable. I asked, playing curious, whether the sect leader did not hold absolute power as the strongest cultivator in the sect. No, Guga said that was hardly so, since the sect leader had been jointly elected by the elders. The true peak of the sect's cultivation belonged not to him, but to the first true disciple. That man was said to be the most gifted talent the Taeon sect had produced in 1,000 years, though he roamed far afield and seldom returned. Rumor held that if he wanted the sect leader's seat today, he would hold it by tomorrow at the latest. When I asked the man's name, Noguga faked a cough and admitted he had not managed to learn it, trying hard to cover his embarrassment. Ye Ran rolled her eyes at him, then turned to me and lowered her voice. She had heard plenty of inside word at the law enforcement hall. The infighting in the main city had already bled into the inner and outer sects, and she warned me to be careful in Mystic Valley, since men chasing power would stop at nothing. I laughed and said it surely could not be that dire, and that no one would dare slaughter Mystic Valley just to frame a rival. The instant the words left me, though, a jolt of unease hit. Someone was already raising greedy demons beyond the outer sect, so what exactly was impossible anymore? Yi Ran caught my worry, reached over to press my hand, and soothed me. She promised she would persuade the law enforcement hall to step up patrols around the various medicine valleys. I withdrew my hand as if by reflex. I had let my guard down for a single moment, and she had seized it to ambush me. In truth, I had seen it coming, and only feared that pulling away too fast might rouse the suspicions of my junior brother and junior sister. Noguga snickered to himself until Ye Ran shot him a glare. I told them earnestly that the two of them needed far more caution than I did. A power struggle of this kind was more dangerous than heading out to slay demons. Noguga declared with total confidence that he could not possibly die. Yi Ran said that as long as she served the law enforcement hall, no one would dare lay a hand on her lightly. The hall oversaw every department, so joining it granted authority above ordinary disciples. Its members had less time to cultivate, though, since they had to handle whatever trouble arose anywhere. I looked at Ye Ran and felt genuinely moved. In the few years since she left the valley, she had transformed completely. She was no longer the little girl trailing at my heels, but a spirited, dependable woman one instinctively trusted. The three of us drank and talked, mostly the two of them, and through their words I gathered a great deal about the Taeon sect. It gratified me that the junior brother and junior sister I had raised now looked after me. I felt a private thrill imagining my disciples one day scattered through every department, giving me eyes and hands everywhere. 2 hours later, No Guga took his leave first. I politely declined Ye Ran's invitation to visit her residence for fine food, then left the outer sex city under her reluctant gaze. Riding my flying sword against the wind, I was in an excellent mood as the sky bled slowly toward crimson. My surface cultivation had reached the 9th layer of chi refining, so my flight was not slow, and I admired the rolling forests as they streamed past. Half an hour vanished in a blink. Then, still in flight, I saw a figure shoot out of the woods ahead and close on me fast, and I eased to a halt. An old man in white robes rode a sword toward me with a wine gourd in hand. His nose was as red as a ripe date, and he looked freshly and thoroughly drunk. The old man in white called out for me to stop, little friend. His aura read as Foundation Establishment, but I loosed a lifespan probe to be safe. The reading gave his name as Imbo-chan and placed him at the first layer of the nascent soul realm. His age showed at 603, his current lifespan at 800, and his potential at 840. Nascent soul. I silently cursed the treacherous old man, who had clearly cultivated a technique to bury his cultivation. We met in the air a moment later. With a kindly smile, he introduced himself as Im Gon, a disciple of the Outer Sect Law Enforcement Hall. He had a matter to ask me about, he said, given how often demonic path spies had been surfacing lately, and he suggested we drop into the woods to talk. I nodded, since refusing would likely change nothing, and it was better to play things by ear. The two of us landed among the trees, and I idly plucked 2 leaves as we went. Imbo-chan took a step closer and asked, in a conspiratorial tone, whether I had ever heard of Seo Rue of the 10,000 Yin sect. That name was far too familiar, since I was the very one who had killed him. Back then, Seo Rue and his partner had tried to muscle their way into my medicine valley, and had even wounded Li Ya. How could I ever forget? I feigned confusion and said I had heard of the 10,000 Yin sect, but had no idea who Seo Rue was. He explained that Seo Rue had been a genius of the sect, the son of its vice sect leader. The man had died in this very region, drawing swarms of spies to investigate the cause. As he spoke, he stepped forward, and I promptly retreated to keep my distance. Seeing my wariness, he grinned and asked whether I truly suspected him of being a spy for the 10,000 Yin sect. I shook my head and said this junior would never dare, only that this junior had honestly never heard of Seo Rue. Since he came from the law enforcement hall, I asked why he needed to question me at all. He threw back his head and laughed, then swept his sleeve. Surging spiritual power spread out like mist to blanket an area several miles across. Rattled, I lifted my sword and watched him. He uncorked the gourd, and a foul reek of alcohol spilled into the air as he grinned in a hideous way. He told me not to be afraid, since 15 of my fellow disciples were already inside to keep me company. Gritting my teeth, I demanded to know who he really was, and whether he could at least let me die knowing the truth. He sneered that I had surely already guessed. Then he thrust out a hand and clawed at the empty air, and a powerful spiritual force bound me and dragged me forcibly toward him. I wore a mask of despair as my body hurtled through the air at him. He reached out with his left hand to seize me, while his right tipped the gourd to his lips. At that instant, I let a terrifying aura erupt from my body, and it shattered his spiritual power in a single beat. His pupils blew wide, and reflected in them was a single leaf sheathed in razor sword chi. Quick as a lightning strike, it drove clean through his brow. Blood sprayed as the leaf continued along its path. Trunk after trunk shattered in its wake, and dust boiled upward like a gray wall miles long rising from the earth. Imbo-chan shuddered from head to foot, his face full of disbelief. He choked out in shock and fury that I had hidden my cultivation, that I was despicable. I crossed to him in a single step and pressed my right index and middle fingers together like a sword against his chest. Sword chi burst out and shattered his physical body in the same instant, scattering the dust behind him. Its force was so overbearing that the trees toppled outward, and a trench several miles long tore open across the ground. From within the rolling dust, a figure suddenly flew free. It was an infant with an aged, eerie face, and it was Imbo-chan's nascent soul fleeing toward the horizon at full speed. Then a whistle of parted air reached its ears, and it turned on instinct. A leaf came screaming in at high speed and annihilated the nascent soul outright, blooming a mist of blood in the air. I raised a hand and called my flying sword back to my grip. Taking a step as sword chi racked my body, I turned into a streak of sword light that shot away and vanished into the forest. I did not fly toward Mystic Valley, but struck off in another direction entirely. On the way, a prompt surfaced in my mind. I had successfully seized 25 years of lifespan from Imbo-chan of the first layer of the Nascent Soul Realm. The haul was a bit thin, but there was no helping it. At 603 years old, he had only about 197 years of life left to take. I did not dwell on it. I took a wide looping detour and then raced back to Mystic Valley at top speed, climbing in through the window into the attic hall. I sat at the table, raised my right hand, and pulled a jar of wine from the cabinet through the air before drinking hard. After a long gulp, I set the jar down gently. My right hand was trembling, and my heart slammed against my ribs, so I fought to steady my breathing. That had been horrifyingly close, running into a demonic path spy on the road home. Fearing that my strike had made too much of a scene, I resolved not to leave the valley for the coming month. It was simply too dangerous. If an Ascent Soul expert could leap out to block my path today, then one day a soul transformation figure, or something higher, might do the same. I hurried to bring up my attribute panel, and looking at my lifespan of over 91,000 years, the knot in my chest loosened a little. The path of cultivation was truly riddled with peril. An ordinary 9th layer chi refining cultivator could be waylaid by a 1st layer Ascent Soul great cultivator. And how is that not terrifying? I thought of the 15 souls trapped in that wine gourd and could not help pitying them. Next, I resolved to force a fresh harvest of herbs and push my lifespan toward 100,000 years. Crossing that line might unlock some new function, and then I would spend the lifespan at once. I drew a deep breath, took out the Travels of the Azure Wanderer, and used it to pull my thoughts elsewhere. Night settled in, and cheers from the disciples drifted through the window, so I swept out my divine sense to look. It turned out Dang Wu and So Han were sparring again, with the others gathered to watch the fun. On any ordinary evening I would have gone down to enjoy the show, but tonight I had no heart for it. I kept my eyes on the Travels of the Azure Wanderer, calmer now yet still a touch on edge. After a while, footsteps approached and the door swung open. Gianjin walked in quickly and reported that senior brother and second senior brother were fighting. Then her gaze dropped to the book's cover, and her eyebrow arched. I closed the Travels of the Azure Wanderer and asked, keeping my face even, whether they did not spar all the time. How had it turned into a real fight? Gianjin pulled her eyes off the cover and answered anxiously. Second senior brother had used a set of sword techniques, and senior brother had mocked them as far too soft. Second senior brother had gone into a rage, and even after stabbing senior brother, he refused to stop. Hearing that, I rose at once, and master and disciple hurried downstairs together. By now the crowd had stopped cheering and was struggling to talk, so Han down. Under the cover of night, his hair hung wild and he looked like a vengeful ghost, swinging his sword in a frenzy. His eyes actually glowed with a bloody light. Dang Wu faced him in a sorry state, his robe slashed to ribbons, 2 shocking wounds across his chest, blood staining his trousers red. Oh Shin and So-chan kept trying to step in, but So-han's blade was too vicious to approach. The disciples scrambled aside the moment they saw me arrive. I took 2 steps and crossed into the space between the two of them. My left hand caught So-han's right wrist, while my left arm blocked Dang Wu's incoming leg. Dang Wu was knocked staggering backward, and could not help exclaiming at how hard my arm was. Then he let out a long breath, his gaze at So-han shadowed with lingering fear. Held fast by the wrist, So-han could not move, and when I squeezed, the sword clattered from his grip to the ground. I barked at him to wake up. He shuddered all over as the bloodthirsty hatred slowly drained from his eyes. Standing a little way off, Oh Shin was privately astonished at how fast I had moved. Even though I had reached the 9th layer of chi refining, no one here had ever taken me for a true expert, mostly because I so often belittled myself. This single move overturned Oh Shin's whole impression of me. He suddenly felt that his senior brother was not simple at all. So Qian, for his part, took it in stride, since I had once subdued a crazed Meng Rang in much the same way. In his heart, my combat ability had always seemed formidable and reliable, whatever my spiritual root. The other disciples were stunned too, watching me make a move for the first time and effortlessly pin down 2 men at the 7th layer of chi refining. Gyeonjin cheered first and broke the silence, and the rest crowded around chattering all at once. They praised me, wondered whether second senior brother had suffered chi deviation, and blamed senior brother for goading him, while I kept my eyes fixed on So-han. So-han gasped for breath, and his body suddenly folded like collapsing mud. My grip on his wrist kept him from hitting the ground. He looked up, gazing at me weakly, and managed only the first fumbling words of an apology. Then his neck tilted and he passed out on the spot. I had 2 disciples carry So-han back to his room, then turned to look at Dang Wu. Under my gaze, his face flushed red, and though he did not know how to explain himself, a stubborn grievance lingered in him, since after all he was the wounded one. I told him flatly to go stop the bleeding first, and he bowed quickly and left. I looked over the rest and asked why they had not dispersed, and whether they meant to skip their cultivation for the day. Then I turned and walked toward the pavilion. They traded glances at my back, and though I had spoken no harsh words, they all took me for angry. They never guessed that I simply had no appetite to lecture anyone. That night, every disciple in the valley carried private worries and struggled to settle their minds, while I stayed alone in the pavilion. In the second half of the night, I felt several powerful divine senses sweep past. My clash with Imbochon had finally drawn the Taehyun sect's notice. Early the next morning, Sohan came to see me, having arrived to apologize. I told him there was no use apologizing to me, since he had not been the one to injure me. He gritted his teeth and protested that Dangwoo had mocked his sword techniques first. I asked whether he had ever told Dangwoo where his sword art came from, and he could only stammer. I reminded him that he and Dangwoo had entered Medicine Valley on the same day and shared the closest bond of all. He knew exactly what kind of person Dangwoo was, blunt of tongue but sound of heart. My tone had grown heavy, since after so many years together I did not want my disciples turning into enemies. So I made no move to forbid him from continuing to cultivate the heaven-hating divine sword. Such a thing could not be forced, and trying to stop it might only wreck the bond between master and disciple. So Han thought back over his years with Dangwoo and could not help feeling guilt. In the beginning, Dangwoo had only been teasing him about his weak sword techniques. So Han, already low over his failure to master the heaven-hating divine sword, had let an argument flare. Dangwoo grew provoked and traded ever sharper words, which finally tipped Sohan into a demonic state. He drew a deep breath and told me earnestly that he had been wrong, and that he would go find senior brother in a little while. I told him not to wait a while, but to go now, since I also needed to check on the medicinal herbs. I stood and walked toward him, and the two of us stepped out of the pavilion, one after another, Sohan pulling the door shut behind him. Matching my pace, he could not help asking whether I meant to question him about why he had lost control the night before. Without turning back, I said it likely traced to his heaven-hating divine sword. His father had passed the technique to him, and whether to cultivate it was not mine to decide, so he would have to think clearly about what mattered most in his own heart. So Han slowed and stopped before the stairs, staring blankly at my back, weighing what was most important. I had no time to fret over my disciples' quarrels, and I had already said what needed saying. If the two of them could not get along, I would eventually let them leave Mystic Valley and never cross paths again. I began inspecting the herbs plot by plot to see which were nearing maturity. Since I had to bank 100,000 years of lifespan as fast as I could, I went ahead and harvested some of the herbs that stood close to ripe. Of course, I left the ones still far from maturity untouched, for I was not so deranged as to gut my own foundation. With so many channels for collecting lifespan now, I felt little panic. Above the mountain forest, cultivators hung in the air on their magical artifacts. Below them, law enforcement hall disciples combed the woods. Ye ran among them. Cho Gyung-pung stood on a flying sword, his right sleeve snapping in the wind, his whole bearing steeped in a weary weathered air. He was no longer the high-spirited man of the past. An old man flew over astride a gourd and passed him the leaf in his hand, saying it looked to be the work of the flying leaf sword immortal. The soul wine gourd of the 10,000 yin sect's helmsman in Bochun had been found nearby, he added, and inside it were the souls of 15 Taehyun sect disciples. Cho Gyung-pung took the leaf and studied it closely, finding its surface covered in tiny sword marks impossible to notice at a glance. He mused aloud whether that meant the flying leaf sword immortal was truly a fellow member of their own sect. The old man nodded and said it seemed so. The earlier attack on Jawa Iljium had likely been a factional dispute, and anyone who could slay Imbochun so easily would surely have killed Jawa Iljium outright had he wished it. Cho Gyung-pung fell silent. The old man glanced at his fluttering right sleeve and told him it was time to let go of the mental block and reattach his arm soon. Cultivating with only his left hand would harden into a habit too difficult to break later. Cho Gyung-pung shot back asking why he should reattach it at all. If the flying leaf sword immortal could wield a leaf as a sword, there was no reason he had to grip a blade with his right hand. Hearing that, the old man shook his head with a bitter smile and gave up trying to persuade him. Deeper in the forest, Ye Ran stood in a gully and looked toward its far end, which seemed to stretch to the very ends of the earth. Her eyes filled with shock. A female disciple came over and marveled that the one behind it all had been the flying leaf sword immortal, and that this terrifying scene had been carved by a single leaf. The other disciples echoed her, exclaiming over the power of the flying leaf sword immortal, and Ye Ran found herself yearning too. Exactly how high a realm did one have to reach to hold such dreadful strength? Then she turned to look in another direction, worry surfacing in her eyes. Ever since Imbochun died, a flight of cultivators had passed over Mystic Valley every few days, most of them at the Foundation Establishment realm. Now and then I would catch a glimpse of Ye Ran among them. She never came down to visit me, drifting past as though she happened to be traveling through. Yet she had crossed over Mystic Valley 4 separate times in a single month, and I would have been a fool not to read her intentions. That girl. I stood at the windowsill watching the cultivators fade toward the horizon, and a warmth spread through my chest. I pulled up my attribute panel and looked at my lifespan of 99,990 years, my hands clenching tight inside my sleeves. It was almost here. Tonight I would break through in realm. The forced harvest this month would thin the coming year's yield, but after another year it would recover and climb again. I had also deliberately held back space for 10 years of lifespan, meaning to reap it quietly under cover of night. I wanted to fully savor the feeling of splurging every drop of lifespan I owned. Seeing that the hour was still early, I truly could not sit still, so I went downstairs. In the courtyard, I spotted Sohan practicing his sword forms on the eastern hilltop, from a distance. Ever since the trouble that night, he had turned withdrawn, and the others no longer dared bother him for fear he might snap again. He and Dang Wu had patched things up. After learning the origin of the heaven-hating divine sword, Dang Wu had apologized, though he had thrown himself into training even harder afterward. Apology or not, Dang Wu had no wish to lose to Sohan a second time. Being the senior brother after all, I came to the wooden fence at the edge of the garden, looked out and let a smile settle on my face. Yan Jin trotted over and asked, "Curious, what had me so pleased?" I rubbed her head and laughed, teasing whether I usually did not smile enough. She giggled and pressed me, since my mood was good today, to teach her the withered wind leg. I asked in surprise whether she had not always hated drilling sword and leg techniques. What had changed her heart? She clenched her fists and declared that she wanted to be like Junior Marshal Uncle Ye Ran and become a disciple of the law enforcement hall. It turned out that Oshin and So Qian had glimpsed Ye Ran earlier and fallen to sighing over her. Gian Jin, weeding nearby, had overheard every word. Once she learned that the Taoist robe Ye Ran wore belonged to the law enforcement hall, she had come to admire her enormously. I laughed and agreed to teach her, thinking privately that sending this girl off early would be no bad thing, since she was forever coming to disturb my reading. And so I set to teaching Gian Jin the withered wind leg. When deep night came and all the disciples had returned to their rooms, I finally slipped out of Mystic Valley in secret. Before I left, I stopped by the garden to pick 2 Tier 3 medicinal herbs. The night swallowed the mountains and I slipped through the forest at speed. I kept to the far side of the range from where I had cut down in Bochan. This time I meant to travel a full 100 miles out before I attempted my breakthrough. A month of quiet watching had taught me one useful thing. No law enforcement hall disciples patrolled in the dead hours before dawn. As I ran, notices unrolled across my vision in their silent way. I had plundered 6 years of lifespan from a stand of bitterroot grass at the 3rd tier. Then 7 more came from another clump of the same. After that, a line appeared that I had never seen before. It told me my lifespan had passed 100,000 years for the first time, which unlocked something the panel called lifespan deduction. The readout explained that deduction let me spend lifespan to deduce the Tao, karma, and fate. The cost was set by whatever I wished to peer into. My brows drew together at once, because I smelled a swindle dressed up as a gift. Part of me feared the thing meant to drain my whole hoard in a single greedy gulp. I decided to prod it gently before I trusted it with anything. The instant the function surfaced, I understood in my bones how to work it. Deduction, I saw, was really just asking questions with lifespan as the coin. So I asked it quietly whether Gong Gyong wanted to kill me right now. About 2 breaths later, the answer arrived. It told me the deduction would cost 300 years and asked whether I wished to proceed. I refused on the spot, since 300 years spent to soothe the passing worry was plain robbery. Even so, the test left me easier. The function had warned me of the price before it ever touched my store. I resolved to lean on that trick as rarely as possible. Burning irreplaceable lifespan to chase the unknown did not seem worth the gamble, not while I could avoid it. On the road ahead, I stayed cautious. I kept my divine scent spread wide so I would not blunder into another nascent soul cultivator. The night was desolate, and no Yao beasts crossed my path. Still, the traces of wild animals lay everywhere, mostly grazers, with rabbits and rats the most common. When I had gone about 50 miles from Mystic Valley, I suddenly spotted the white spirit rat. In the woods, the little rascal was pestering a rabbit, trailing its tail and hopping after it. It sniffed forward now and then like a fat dog that had confused itself for a hound. The sight was so humble that I pretended not to see it. I slipped away without disturbing its game. So that was why the creature kept escaping and why its bounding gait had grown to resemble a rabbit's. I recalled the scene and did not know whether to laugh or sigh. The white spirit rat had been raised badly. At least I still had my vast sky dragon, and thinking of that beast's magnificent bearing lifted my mood again. Half an incense stick later, I reached a dense stand of trees. The leaves knotted together so thickly that a flyer overhead would never spot me. I sat cross-legged beneath a great trunk, took a deep breath, and pulled up my attribute panel. When I read a lifespan of 100,000 in 3 years, anticipation crept over my face. A hoard that size counted as genuine wealth, and I could finally raise my attributes properly. I would begin with the spiritual route, since that was the hardest thing in the world to improve. After a moment of hesitation, I decided to be generous, and poured in 10,000 years at once. The notices tumbled out in a frenzy. I comprehended the nature of heaven and earth across the years, my 5 elements perception climbing again and again. At 2,000 years, I caught a strand of the true meaning, and my aptitude turned to top-tier mortal quality, with wood and earth the most prominent. At 5,000 years, the heaven and earth resonance forced a leap. My ordinary 5 elements spiritual root transformed into a 5 elements heavenly spiritual root. By 8,000 years, my wood attribute had climbed to a top-grade wood heavenly spiritual root. Dozens of lines flickered past too fast to blink at. The moment the last one popped, I threw up the lifespan barrier. The grass beneath me glowed with an eerie fluorescence, and the trees behind me sprouted little green lights that lit the whole ward. A 5 elements heavenly spiritual root. I could not help my excitement. This was the strongest root I had ever heard named, and even Ji Haowu of the Ji clan could not measure up to it. A heavenly spiritual root usually carried a single attribute, yet its cultivation speed stood worlds apart from any dual root. According to Li Ya, such a root was the darling of heaven and earth. It was granted only to those born under boundless fortune, or forged by a family that had labored across thousands of years. The whole Taechang dynasty held only one heavenly spiritual root cultivator, hidden somewhere inside the Taeon sect, though Li Ya had never said who. I had long suspected Li Hiondo was one as well, only concealing it very carefully. While I pondered, the spiritual chi of heaven and earth began surging into my body. It left me itching all over with an indescribable comfort beneath the itch. With so much lifespan on hand, 10,000 years suddenly felt like nothing, so I poured in another 10,000 and watched the lines race by. Yet these read only that my perception had increased. Again and again, my Tao heart began to tremble as I realized something had gone wrong. Not until 5,000 years in did my earth root climb to a top-grade heavenly spiritual root. After that, the panel simply repeated the same hollow gains like a bottomless pit. My heart bled at the sight. I cultivated the divine wood pure yang art, so the wood root alone was enough for me. That meant this second stack of 10,000 years would never quicken my cultivation speed again. Spiritual roots were fixed at birth, and in all my hearing no method existed to raise them. Climbing from an ordinary 5 elements root to a heavenly one was already a miracle I had no right to expect. Still, I could not simply let 10,000 years drain away for nothing. Gritting my teeth, I threw in another 10,000, my face already darkening. The fire root ground its way up to a top-grade heavenly spiritual root. Surely it would not cost a full 10,000 to lift a single root. I invested again, and the chi pouring in thickened until gray and red motes swirled around me. After dozens of notices, my water root made the same climb. If I gathered all 5, I wondered, would there be a true qualitative change? I poured in 10,000 more, and my metal root finally transformed. The panel rewrote its spiritual root line to read top-grade 5 elements heavenly spiritual root. Then I looked at my remaining lifespan and my eyes went dull. 50,000 years had vanished just like that. After the mad rush, an unprecedented emptiness settled in my chest. Earth chi surged into me in wild currents, and my body fell into a strange state. It was itchy and warm, yet without the slightest pain. Countless motes of light drifted around me, fire red and wood green and water blue, metal yellow and earth gray. They glittered like a galaxy in the dark. I drifted in a trance, my thoughts tangled and slow. An hour later, the transformation completed, and the whole world seemed reborn to me. The fresh shock to my perception left me clean and light. The feeling was so wonderful that I decided 50,000 years had not been wasted after all. A top-grade 5 elements heavenly spiritual root was enough to stand proud anywhere in the Taechang dynasty. How it ranked across the wider mortal world I could not yet say, since I did not know how vast that world truly was. I drew a breath and turned my eyes to the cultivation technique line. Should I spend here too? I feared that once a technique climbed past some threshold, the later costs would balloon beyond anything I expected. I already held a top-grade root and a serviceable divine wood pure yang art. If I kept laying foundations forever, when would it ever end? A soul transformation demonic cultivator might leap out to ambush me tomorrow. Better to drive straight for raw cultivation level, since that was the thing most likely to keep me breathing. I told my brand new root not to fail me. Then I invested 10,000 years into my cultivation and set the panel loose. The first lines were bleak. After 10 years of forced descent, I broke toward the soul transformation realm, met the 5 elements heavenly tribulation, and did not survive it. At 100 years, the same failure repeated. I kept my expression flat, since one failed tribulation per century was a rate I could stomach. I did not believe I would fail a full 100 times. Fortune proved kinder than my fears. At 2,700 years, I finally endured the 5 elements heavenly tribulation and broke into the first level of the soul transformation realm. From there, the levels rose smoothly, 2nd and 3rd and 4th and 5th, all the way to the 9th. When I forced toward the void realm, the tribulations turned cruel again. The profound mystery heavenly tribulations slew me twice over as the years climbed toward 10,000. At 9,800 years, I at last survived it and crossed into the first level of the void realm. By the final year, my cultivation had settled and steadied. I pulled up the panel, saw nearly 40,000 years of lifespan still waiting, and felt the corners of my mouth rise on their own. I did not keep burning lifespan once I reached that first level of the Void Realm. I feared the spiritual chi I would need might take so long to gather that daybreak would catch me still out here. If the disciples found me missing from the valley, the trouble would multiply. Following the last of the notices, I felt the spiritual chi within the earth surge upward in a frantic tide. It ripped from the ground like a wild wave, tossing my robes and dragging at my black hair. Yet it did not fling me away, because the chi had already drilled into my body and tethered me to the soil like chains. The commotion far outstripped my earlier breakthrough to the nascent soul realm, and the ground beneath me trembled with it. I rejoiced in secret that I had the lifespan barrier, since without it my cultivation could never have stayed hidden. Then a new worry surfaced. A disturbance this large might reach the Taehan sect itself. The barrier did not conjure spiritual chi from the void, but drew it up from underground, and that underground chi belonged to the sect. A fresh hypothesis followed on its heels. Perhaps my cultivation speed inside the lifespan evolution scaled with the concentration of spiritual chi around me. That felt very likely once I thought of Lee Haeyondo. A man of 230 years standing at the 8th level of the soul transformation realm was simply incredible. The gap between us was immense, and if Lee Haeyondo also carried a heavenly root, his advantages would stretch far past anything I could match. As emperor of a dynasty, he could claim the most advanced immortal cave, the finest cultivation pills, and a top-tier technique. Add formations and artifacts beyond counting, and it was clear why he had crossed his tribulation so smoothly. When Jwa Ilgiam had undergone tribulation, a crowd of cultivators guarded his formation. Others prepared thoroughly before their own trials, while I simply gritted through mine barehanded inside the evolution. In reality, to die during tribulation meant the total ruin of body and soul, with no chance to try again every 200 years. Set against Lee Haeyondo, my evolutionary cultivation looked far behind. Yet the comparison was not fair, because in truth I was a man of 34 standing at the first level of the Void Realm. Could Lee Haeyondo have reached the Void Realm before the age of 300? Was there a second soul anywhere who cultivated naked and hard and still faced down the heavenly tribulation the way I did? Thinking so, I felt my balance return. The lifespan poured into cultivation was ultimately just a number, while my real cultivation was the genuine article. At the same time I mulled whether I ought to practice techniques of other attributes, or hunt down a true 5 elements technique to unlock the full potential of my top-grade root. The sound of the earth's chi surging into me grew louder still. A vortex had already formed inside the barrier. The 5-colored spiritual chi rose until it nearly drowned my figure from sight. Far away, dark clouds swirled and slowly smothered the bright moon. Inside a small pavilion in a quiet residence, an oil lamp burned on a table. The white-haired Jwa Ilgiam sat there with a book in his hands, its cover showing the faint title Investiture of the Gods. He murmured the verses to himself. He spoke of golden light atop the head dividing into 5 colors, and of red lotus beneath the feet chasing 10,000 miles. He spoke of the 8 trigrams immortal robe carrying purple chi, and of the 3-edged precious sword named Chungpyeong. A look of reminiscence crossed his face as he read. For several years the book had held him spellbound, and each rereading gave him fresh insight. It carried no cultivation methods, yet the immortal spells it described made him ache with longing. He felt the principles of the Tao lay hidden within its pages, only he could not yet see through to them. Then Jwa Ilgiam sensed something and flipped upright, his gaze snapping toward the ground. The night lay desolate, and the cold wind rustled and swelled. The candle flame guttered as though it might die at any moment. He was not alone in his unease. From every direction, cultivators shot out of the residences and courtyards. More and more outer sect disciples gathered above the city, trading confused questions about the sinking spiritual chi. Some wondered aloud whether a demon had invaded. Others scoffed that no one would dare court death inside the Taeyeon sect, while a few guessed that a great formation was activating underground. Yiran flew from her courtyard on her sword as well, staring anxiously toward the outer sect streets. Endless streams of cultivators rose into the dim sky, and the utility disciples who could not ride swords huddled in the roads below, panicked and uneasy. Everyone could feel the chi draining down into the earth, a thing none of them had ever met. What frightened them most was how the draining quickened by the moment, thinning the outer sect's chi at frightening speed. Spiritual chi was the most critical thing a sect possessed, the very foundation on which a great sect stood. In the mountain forest I had already stepped into the soul transformation realm. My nascent soul rose from within to float above my head. Ordinarily, an ascent soul could not leave the body, for once it did the tie to the flesh would sever. Only a cultivator near death would send it out to seize a fresh body. The soul transformation realm changed that. It let the nascent soul mature into a primordial spirit whose emergence never cut the bond to the flesh, invisible to anyone below the realm unless it chose to show itself. As the primordial spirit took shape, my divine sense underwent an earth-shattering change of its own. I watched my nascent soul gather into a green lotus in bloom. My primordial spirit rose slowly from within it, wearing my exact face and even my clothing. The soul transformation realm was not my stopping point. I kept pushing higher, and the chi I devoured swelled larger and larger. Soon the forest outside the barrier began to shiver as well, which frightened me badly. The commotion had grown far too big. I dared not let my primordial spirit drift beyond the barrier, fearing it would meet some soul transformation cultivator sweeping the area. The Taehan sect surely kept such experts on hand. Even a few strong outer sect elders could reach the nascent soul realm, and the inner sect in the main city held far more. I even suspected the sect concealed a Void Realm Master. Otherwise, there was no reason for Lee Hyondo to hide his cultivation at the 8th level of the Soul Transformation Realm. An hour on, my cultivation had reached the 9th level of the Soul Transformation Realm. 2 figures streaked across the night sky. As my eyes caught their true shapes, I cast Lifespan Probe at once and read 2 Nascent Soul Cultivators. That wound me tighter still, so that I could only pray no one glanced down at this patch of forest. The barrier could hide my figure from the world, yet it could not stop a passerby from stumbling right over me. After that, powerful cultivators kept slashing across the sky, the weakest of them at the Nascent Soul realm. Before long, I saw soul transformation figures as well, and more than one of them. I felt as if I had punched a hole in the heavens. The worst of it was that I was still climbing toward the Void Realm, which demanded an even more massive draft of chi. That night was destined to be a restless one. Not until dawn did my cultivation slow at last, the first level of the Void Realm. Once a cultivator reached it, the primordial spirit could roam 10,000 miles. Spiritual power, divine sense, perception, and blood energy all took a great leap upward together. I rose slowly to my feet as sunlight pierced the sky and poured into the barrier. It landed on me and draped me in a cloak of rosy cloud, and I looked toward the rising sun with a smile. The spiritual power within me felt boundless, granting me the sense that I could do anything at all. I dismissed the barrier and set off toward Mystic Valley. The barrier alone had swallowed nearly 2,000 years, proof enough of how enormous the night's commotion had been. With my breakthrough finished, the world had returned to normal. Still, the spiritual chi in the forest ran far thinner than the day before, and even at the Void Realm I could not begin to guess how much I had drunk down. On the way home, I watched great cultivators cross the sky again. Counting from the night before, I had already seen 7 soul transformation great cultivators, which left me marveling at the sheer depth of the Taehan sect. I hurried back to Mystic Valley and stepped out of the pavilion to lead my disciples through their morning exercise. Ye Ran asked whether I had felt the spiritual chi sink in the night, her brows knitting as she spoke of it. The other disciples chimed in that they had felt it too. They had spent the hours afraid that Mystic Valley might collapse beneath them. I smiled and reminded them this was the Taehan sect, the safest ground in the whole Taechang dynasty. So how could it possibly cave in? That eased their worry a good deal. Oh Shin offered his own guess, that a formation lay behind it, and that a great cultivator in the sect had likely broken through and drawn in a vast tide of chi. Plainly, he had witnessed such a thing at the Thousand Autumns Pavilion, though he could not say so aloud. Then Gyeonjin fixed her eyes on me and asked why I seemed a little different today. I rolled my eyes and told her rudely that she thought I had changed every single day. If she wanted me to teach her leg techniques, she should simply ask. The others could not hold back their laughter, and Gyeonjin smiled in embarrassment. The exercise began in earnest, and while I led it, I familiarized myself with my brand new spiritual power. When it ended, I did not return to my room but walked toward the nearby forest. The breakthrough had squeezed dry a great many of my herbs, so the harvest for the next 2 years would suffer. I needed to clear more waste ground and widen my planting beds. A dignified great cultivator of the Void Realm, outplanting flowers and grass for them all, and the Taehan sect ought to count itself content. I thought it in good humor as I entered the trees. Cultivators streaked overhead once more, a sight that set the disciples at ease. It proved the sect was indeed watching over the matter and would not leave them to fend for themselves. Not until noon did Ye Ran come back to Mystic Valley. After chatting a while, she finally shook off the others and trailed me into the pavilion. She shut the door and the windows, then pasted talisman papers across the frames. I watched her nervously and asked what on earth she meant to do. Submit or not submit, I wondered wildly. Once the last of her wards was fixed in place, she sat down at the table and poured herself tea. She told me a great matter had arisen, that the demonic lord might well be about to attack. I sat, genuinely startled, and asked who this demonic lord was, and which sect or faction claimed him. She answered gravely that her master suspected the demonic Lord Jie of the Heavenly Demon sect was coming soon. When I frowned and asked how she had reasoned her way there, she laid it out. The night before, the spiritual chi of the outer sect had been drained until even the inner sect felt it. Not long ago, Imbochon of the Myriad Yin sect had been executed by the Flying Leaf Sword Immortal. Taken together, she said, these events proved the demonic path was preparing to besiege the Taehan sect, with the draining of the outer sect's chi being the first step. Across the whole demonic Lord Jie could accomplish such a thing. It was said his demonic technique could make every living thing within 1,000 miles simply vanish. And real fear rose in her eyes as she spoke. I nearly choked. I was the one who had killed Mbochan, and I was the one behind the night's great disturbance. Now the demonic path was taking the blame in my place. Though I had passively become a spy of the Thousand Autumns Pavilion, I had never once counted myself a demonic cultivator. I thought a moment, then comforted her that if the sky fell, there were taller people to hold it up. The Taehan sect was the foremost sect of the Taechang dynasty, so even a demonic path assault would find it desperately hard to shake. Ye-Ran drew a deep breath, and a stubborn resolve settled over her face. She gritted her teeth and proposed that we fly far away together. She said she had already reached the Foundation Establishment realm, that we could hide in some uninhabited range and cultivate, and that she would help me climb to Foundation Establishment myself. I nearly lost my composure. The girl was clearly trying to seize the chaos as an excuse to elope with me. Helplessly, I told her she was exaggerating and asked where in all the world was truly safe. If we buried ourselves in the deep mountains and ran into a golden core demonic cultivator, neither of us could do a thing about it. Besides, I added, this was all only her guessing, and I did not think the demonic path would attack at all. If they truly meant to besiege the sect, they should have struck already. Making so much noise and then delaying could only mean they were handing the Taehyun sect time to recall its absent great cultivators. Yi-Ran listened and had to admit it made sense. After a moment, she asked whether I would at least come to the outer sect with her to avoid the limelight. I told her seriously that she truly need not worry over me, and that she must not let me hinder her cultivation. If she really wanted the best for me, I said, she should strive to grow strong and look after me later. That was for her own good too, since a cultivator who did not put cultivation first would sooner or later meet an hour when she was powerless. She looked ashamed, thinking she had indeed let herself grow anxious. Then I told her, with a proud little smile, that I stood at the 9th level of the Qi refining realm, and no ordinary demonic cultivator would find me easy to kill. She chuckled at that, quickly covering her mouth. She pointed out that any demonic cultivator bold enough to sneak into the Taeyon sect would hardly be a Qi refiner. After all, the Imbochon who had died was rumored to be an old monster of the Nascent Soul realm. I only hummed and asked what of it, since surely a Nascent Soul old monster need not lift a finger to kill someone like me. She agreed at once that I was the most amazing of all, and the tension drained out of her. Afterward, I asked about the state of the outer sect, and she hid nothing, telling me each detail in turn. Only at evening did I finally see her off. I had planned to refine my cultivation and spells that night, but with the outer sect on a war footing, I did not dare stir. I chose instead to lie low. One doubt still gnawed at me. If the surrounding Qi were already drained and I pressed on with a breakthrough, what would follow? The barrier would likely reach out to draw Qi from even farther away. If that happened, the Taehan sect would never sit still for it. For the next 3 days, I stayed inside Mystic Valley and did not even descend into the 8 sceneries grotto heaven. The vast sky dragon had begun to cultivate, and it fared well enough without meat for many days. I had set aside a batch of ripe azure vine fruit for it to eat whenever hunger struck. I shared a soul resonance with the beast, so it remembered every instruction I gave. From birth, it had never caused me a lick of trouble, a child that set my mind fully at ease. On the 3rd night, I sat reading in the attic. With my top-grade 5 elements heavenly root, I could drink the spiritual Qi within 100 feet in a single breath, and convert it with rare efficiency. Because the outer sect's Qi was still recovering, cultivating openly felt unwise, so I held myself in check. Then I sensed something, and my expression shifted. I did not rise and kept my eyes on the page. An incense stick, later a figure appeared outside my window. It quietly pushed the window open before slipping inside, and I cast Lifespan Probe on the instant. The reading named him Bu Ung at the 2nd level of the Foundation Establishment realm. 160 years lived, of a natural span near 200. His ceiling around 240. After Li Hyondo and Im Bochan, I had grown far more reliant on the probe, for the cultivation world crawled with sneaking men. Bu Ung looked about 50, not tall, dressed in black. His eye sockets were dark and his gaze sharp as an eagle's, and the whole of him gave off a scheming air. He stood and asked whether I was the Valley Master. I frowned and admitted it, then asked who he was. He did not answer at first, but sized me up. After a few breaths, he suddenly spoke the passphrase, of 1,000 autumns, of azure vine heart, of no regrets. I stayed silent while my divine sense spread out to confirm he had come alone. Then I gave the reluctant countersign, that 10,000 laws wither and fall silent, and the root is hard to find. His expression softened at once. He walked to the table and sat as though returning to his own home, pouring himself tea and asking where Zhang Hyundan was, whether the man was already dead. I nodded and said my master had left, then asked why he had sought me out. He drank a cup and asked whether I knew the whereabouts of the azure vine tree, his gaze sweeping the room as he spoke. It passed over the books and the herbs wrapped in spirit-protecting paper. Seeing that he did not truly seem to care about the tree, I played dumb and asked what an azure vine tree even was. He drew his eyes back, studied me again, and asked whether my master had never told me. I shook my head, so he explained that the azure vine tree was the sacred tree of the Thousand Autumns Pavilion. More than 200 years ago, the pavilion had sent someone to carry one into the outer sect of the Taeon sect. Over the long years, the trail had been cut, and no one now knew where it lay hidden. More than 200 years ago, I thought, and I frowned inwardly, wondering whether Gang Yong had kept something from me. Buong sighed and confessed the truth. His own master was nearing a breakthrough to the soul transformation realm, and the tribulation ahead was terribly dangerous. He hoped to find azure vine fruit to help the old man through it. Playing the wide-eyed junior, I asked what realm soul transformation even was. He stroked his beard and laughed as though he were the one about to ascend. He explained that above foundation establishment came golden core, and above that Nascent soul, and above Nascent soul the soul transformation realm. In an astonished tone, I said that even a Nascent soul cultivator could be endangered by tribulation, when I had heard the Nascent soul was already the equal of an immortal. He scoffed that immortality was still a long road off. Even the step from foundation establishment to golden core demanded tribulation, and all tribulations were a road of 9 deaths, growing deadlier the higher one climbed. His own master, he added with a look of longing, had spent 10 years preparing for it. When I asked what there was to prepare, and whether one could not simply endure the trial as it came, he glared as if my question were unspeakably stupid. He explained that one needed medicinal pills to hold up spiritual power and mend wounds, a formation to lend support, and several sets of artifacts besides. He had never heard of anyone crossing a tribulation bear. His answer left me far more relieved than he could have guessed. Then Buong laughed and remarked that I clearly kept a great many herbs in this medicine valley. He suggested I take him as my master, promising to back me and teach me spells in exchange for 30% of the valley's yearly harvest. When I frowned, he lowered his voice and murmured that his own master, who would become my grandmaster, dwelt in the inner sect. Once the man broke through to soul transformation, he would surely be made an elder, after which I could have whatever I wished. I widened my eyes and asked, feigning surprise whether his master had not then lurked here for many years. If so, why did he not know where the azure vine tree lay? He answered that it was a long story and that we should settle the apprenticeship first. Still hesitant, I asked whether this was truly his master's wish. He grew displeased and said of course not, that his master did not even know he had come to this medicine valley. I was merely a utility disciple whom a figure like his master would never deign to notice. I stood, looked down at him, and said I had one last question. He frowned and demanded to know what it was, plainly itching to beat this talkative brat to death. I asked whether he knew what realm lay above soul transformation. He froze, then flew into a rage, for he did not know the answer and took the question as mockery. Just as he moved to rise, my right hand was already pressed to his crown. He looked up and found my face gone cold, my eyes flashing with a hard light. My whole bearing changed in an instant. In that moment, he felt as though he stood before his own master, or rather before something his master had never been, for his master had never been this frightening. He tried to open his mouth, but his awareness fell blank and his eyes lost their focus. I was using the soul-snatching technique. I had never managed to master it before, yet with my top-grade 5 elements heavenly root, I grasped it the moment I tried. I was hardly proficient, but it was more than enough for Buong. My spiritual power pressed him down while my divine sense forced its way into his mind and searched with arrogant ease. Half an hour later, he was dead, and I opened my eyes and let out a long breath. The man truly had not known where the azure vine tree stood, and truly had not been sent by his master. I lifted him into the air with my right hand, and a fire of spiritual power surged from my palm to burn him. I closed my eyes rather than watch the cruel sight. The spiritual flame of the void realm was fierce beyond measure. In less than 4 breaths, Bu was ash, leaving only a storage pouch, and I seized 4 years of lifespan from him. I emptied the pouch of its herbs and spirit stones, but the artifacts and talismans I dared not keep. I burned them along with the pouch to leave no trail leading back to me. The next morning I went downstairs as though nothing had happened. When the disciples gathered for practice, a small guilt gnawed at me. My deeds were beginning to look like the demonic path's own work. Yet a month passed and no other cultivator of the Thousand Autumns Pavilion came looking for me, and at last I breathed easy. One day Duya arrived, and the two of us talked in the attic. He told me the 3rd young miss had mastered the Kirin step, that the clan chief was overjoyed and preparing a celebration. A banquet would be held in the inner sect, where the G-clan servants must attend to welcome the guests. In 10 days, he said he would wait for me before the law enforcement hall of the outer sect. In the meantime, I should ready a batch of herbs as a congratulatory gift, since I might well win the 3rd young miss's favor. I nodded, a decision already forming in my heart. Tonight I would pour lifespan into the 8 direction steps and see for myself how strong the Kirin step that Ji Hyowoo had trained really was. Du Ya came quickly and left quickly, and I could feel his excitement, as though he truly counted himself a member of the Ji clan. I was curious about the inner sect myself, and it was a fine thing to see it through the opening the Ji clan's banquet gave me, so I meant to gather more spirit stones over the coming days to spend once I arrived. At nightfall, I slipped quietly out of Mystic Valley and stopped about 50 miles off, in the opposite direction from my earlier breakthrough. I sat before a cliff face and brought up my attribute panel. I looked straight at the 8 direction steps and invested 5,000 years of lifespan. It was a footwork art, useful in a fight and even more useful for fleeing, so it deserved the improvement. The prompts rose as my thoughts settled. Within a year, I mastered the 8 direction steps, and within 10 years, my grasp became consummate and my feel for movement techniques sharpened. At 50 years, the art upgraded to the 8 directions profound steps. At 300 years, the technique returned to simplicity, and I caught a strand of the true meaning of space, and it climbed to the Kirin step. At 1,000 years, the Kirin step itself returned to simplicity, and rose to the heavenly dragon mysterious true step. By 4,000 years, my stubborn cultivation finally drew a response from heaven and earth. It broke past its limit into the infinite traceless mysterious heaven step. At 5,000 years, that final form reached its consummate peak, and my comprehension of space deepened once more. The 8 direction steps, the profound steps, the Kirin step, the heavenly dragon mysterious true step, and at last, the infinite traceless mysterious heaven step. I was quietly thrilled, and a great tide of memory began pouring into my mind, so I threw up the lifespan barrier and sank into the legacy. Half an hour later, I opened my eyes and checked the ward, finding it had spent only 200 years. Inheriting techniques never raised my cultivation level, yet the process still drank in spiritual chi. Compared with my breakthrough to the Void Realm, the chi absorbed this time was slight. I turned back to the panel, lost in thought. My cultivation level plainly needed raising, yet with my recent low profile I could not act recklessly. In any case, I wanted my techniques improved before my level. I planned to search the inner sect for a 5 elements technique. If nothing good turned up, I would grit my teeth and ride the Divine Wood Pure Yang art to the end. After weighing it, I decided to spend a little on the Thousand Autumns Pavilion secret art Gang Gyung had taught me. The Devil Shadow Divine Art. She had called it perfectly suited to a spy, and I wished to see how true that was. I fed it 2,000 years. The prompts came again. Within 10 years, I initially mastered the Devil Shadow Divine Art, and at 100 years it reached the consummate peak and my casting speed rose. At 200 years, my feel for movement techniques sharpened further. At 500 years, the art returned to simplicity and upgraded to the free devil body art. At 1,000 years, that form turned consummate and deepened my grasp of movement and karma alike. At 1,300 years, it climbed again into the great yin-yang transformation, which turned consummate by the 2,000th year. The Devil Shadow Divine Art, the great yin-yang transformation, and it had upgraded only twice. That told me the secret art was no simple thing, and that Gang Gyung had not deceived me. I raised the barrier once more and let my awareness sink into the legacy. A long while later, I opened my eyes with surprise in them. The art truly was made for a spy. The Devil Shadow Divine Art wrapped its caster in devilish chi, forming a devil shadow that even divine sense could not pierce. The great yin-yang transformation went further still, for it could not be forcibly dispelled. The caster could hold the devil shadow state until death, and even after death the true form would never surface. Best of all, the technique could not be deduced, and no artifact or treasure could tear the shadow away to reveal what lay beneath. It was overbearing beyond words, and with it I could accomplish a great many things in the years ahead. Paired with the infinite traceless mysterious heaven step, it became close to invincible. That footwork already carried the profundity of a teleportation divine ability, and every stride could raise a Dharma image fit for both flight and attack, its depth truly without end. I called up the panel again, satisfaction warm on my face. My name read Go-An, and my lifespan sat at a bit over 30,000 years, against my age of 34. My spiritual root shone as a top grade 5 elements heavenly spiritual root, and my cultivation held at the first layer of the Void Realm. The Divine Wood Pure Yang art and the mysterious Yellow Dragon Chi art both stood at consummate. My infinite traceless mysterious heaven step and great yin-yang transformation now crowned the list of unique skills at consummate as well. Beneath them ran my spells and my lone divine ability, from the soul-snatching technique to the Jaime Array record, each holding steady. A fine harvest for one night. I closed the barrier and stood, and with a single step my figure vanished from the spot. It reappeared dozens of feet off among the trees, then vanished again with another step. It was as if I'd blinked from place to place, the very profundity of the infinite traceless mysterious heaven step. I was barely testing it, for the true reach of a stride ran far beyond that. Soon I returned to Mystic Valley. At noon, under a bright sun, I stood in the city and stared up at the towering halls with open curiosity. The street around me churned with people, and I even glimpsed the shapes of Yao beasts among them. Overhead, a host of cultivators flew back and forth, and this one city alone likely held hundreds of thousands of souls. The Taeon sect kept 4 inner sect cities, and one of them was said to hold hundreds of thousands of disciples. The figure struck me as absurd, and I realized how badly I had underestimated the sect's power and the vastness of the Taecheng dynasty. The 10-day deadline had come. The day before, I had gone to the outer sect to help those disciples manage their immortal caves, finishing only at dawn. When noon arrived, I found Du Ya, and the two of us crossed straight to the inner sect city through the teleportation formation. By Du Ya's account, the outer sect city lay thousands of miles from the inner sect city. The middle ground was given over to Yao beasts the sect raised, to secret realms where disciples trained, and to medicine valleys where high-grade herbs were grown. The teleportation formation, I thought silently, was a marvelous thing that I simply had to study to its depths. I had already asked Du Ya, and learned that in the inner sect one could buy nearly anything, formations included, so long as one carried enough spirit stones or spiritual chi pills. In the cultivation world, those pills served as a kind of currency too. They restored a cultivator's spiritual power and passed for spirit stones, since every sect held to a unified standard where a single pill matched one low-grade spirit stone in worth. Ever since Lee Hayondo had invited me to run a medicine valley, I had nursed the idea of opening more of them. If each valley held its own teleportation formation, the convenience would be enormous. Du Ya urged me from ahead to hurry, and I fell into his pace. As we walked, he pointed out the buildings along the road, and I listened closely, planning to wander the district thoroughly over the next few days. The G-Clan banquet would not conclude quickly, so I had ample chances to roam. I was not only listening, but also working the lifespan probe. Strangely, I saw no one at the Foundation establishment realm, the weakest being Golden Core, yet nearly all of those Golden Core disciples were over 200 years old. Several streets on, I finally caught a Foundation establishment presence. He was a man of only 40, already at the 9th layer of the realm, plainly a genius admitted on the strength of his aptitude. Du Ya seemed to be deliberately broadening my horizons, keeping his stride unhurried, and I was glad of it. Half an hour later, we reached a mansion, vast beyond reason, its courtyard walls running for several miles. 2 great characters carved on the gate plaque read G Mansion. Bold indeed, I complained inwardly, wondering whether every G-Clan disciple of the inner sect truly lived behind these walls. Something about the scale felt off. If this went on, the Taehan sect would one day move to curb the G-Clan, and at that point I would become a spy for the G-Clan in truth. I was affiliated with the Taehan sect for now, yet in my heart the G-Clan mattered more. It had raised me, let me grow, and led me into the foremost sect in the land. Kindness is no offering of low-grade herbs could ever repay. I would not force myself to settle the debt, but if the G-Clan needed me, and the ask was not outrageous, I would not refuse them. 2 Foundation establishment cultivators guarded the mansion gate. When I cast the probe, I read that both were over 100 years old, and clearly no geniuses. Likely former servants of the G-Clan, just as Du Ya and I had been. Du Ya stepped forward with his token in hand, his posture humble, nodding and bowing. The cultivator among them, named Zhang Yan, said thoughtfully that we could take over the watch, and that once dark fell, they would show us to our quarters. Du Ya did not dare refuse and agreed at once, so the 2 of us began standing guard the moment we arrived. As I stood before a Kirin stone statue, an idea struck me. I told Du Ya I would give him 100 low-grade spirit stones to keep watch in my place. I wished to visit the inner sect and buy some medicinal herb seeds, which was itself a service to the third young miss. He was stunned, and though he wanted to refuse, 100 low-grade spirit stones was too generous to wave off. After I'd pressed them into his hands, I set off to wander the inner sect city alone. I had not gone far when a voice called out, asking me why I was here.